They called it a city. But cities have graveyards, not hunting grounds. In Juarez, the missing became the murdered, and the murdered became forgotten. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where darkness deepens with every tale and truth chills sharper than fiction. Tonight, we're diving into 4 gripping stories, each more haunting than the last. If you're ready for the ride, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe. It keeps the stories alive and the truth spreading. So, have you subscribed yet? I'm waiting. Done? Great, thank you. I want you to know that every click and comment counts, and you are very important and highly welcomed here. This is the story of the Daughters of the Desert. Welcome to the edge of 2 worlds, where a border divides nations but couldn't divide evil. For decades, women vanished from the streets of Ciudad Juarez like smoke dissolving into darkness. Their bodies appeared later in the desert, dumped, discarded, destroyed. Hundreds of them. Young women with dreams, with families, with futures that were stolen in the most brutal ways imaginable. This isn't a story about one monster. This is a story about a system that became the monster. About a city that swallowed its daughters whole. About a desert that keeps secrets buried in sand and silence. The dead women of Juarez weren't just murdered, they were erased. And tonight, we're digging up what was meant to stay buried forever. The sun beats down on Ciudad Juarez with a merciless intensity that turns concrete into griddles and metal into brands. This Mexican border city, pressed against El Paso, Texas, like a shadow against light, throbs with the machinery of industry. Maquiladoras, foreign-owned factories, line the industrial zones like tombstones in a corporate cemetery. Inside these buildings, young women assemble electronics, stitch clothing, manufacture auto parts for wages that barely buy tortillas and beans. They come from the rural south, from pueblos where opportunities are as scarce as rain. They come with hope threaded through their fingers, believing that Juarez will give them what their villages couldn't, a future. But Juarez had other plans. The year was 1993 when the pattern first emerged from the chaos. Though some researchers insist the killings began earlier, hidden in the noise of a city already drowning in narco-violence. A young woman named Alma Shavira Farrell disappeared on her way home from her shift at the Maquiladora. She was 13 years old. Just a child, really, but in Juarez, poverty ages you fast, forces you into adult work while your bones are still growing. When Alma's body was found weeks later in a vacant lot, her family learned a terrible new vocabulary. Sexual assault, strangulation, mutilation, dumped. The police shrugged. Another dead girl. What did her family expect? She probably lived a double life. She probably asked for it by working late, by walking alone, by existing as a young woman in Juarez. The authorities handed the grieving mother these accusations like condolences, as if blame could substitute for justice. But Alma wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. The disappearances multiplied like a cancer spreading through the city's young female population. Women vanished from bus stops where they waited after 14-hour factory shifts. They disappeared walking home in broad daylight. They evaporated from downtown streets crowded with witnesses who somehow saw nothing. The pattern was unmistakable to everyone except those whose job it was to notice. Young women, usually between 14 and 25, slender build, long dark hair, working class, poor, powerless. Maria Sagrario Gonzalez Flores was 17 when she walked out of a convenience store and into oblivion. Her body surfaced 3 days later behind a local business, bearing the horrific signature that would become nightmarishly familiar. Evidence of sexual torture, strangulation, signs of prolonged captivity. The medical examiner's reports read like instruction manuals for sadists. Ligature marks, defensive wounds, trauma patterns suggesting the victims had been held for days, sometimes weeks, before their deaths. These weren't crimes of passion or opportunity. These were orchestrated horrors, carefully planned exhibitions of dominance and cruelty. By 1995, the bodies were appearing with disturbing regularity in an area that locals began calling the Killing Fields, a stretch of desert wasteland called Lot Bravo. The terrain there is unforgiving. hard-packed sand studded with rocks, sparse vegetation offering no shade, no shelter, no witness to the atrocities committed under its empty sky. The bodies were often found partially buried, sometimes left exposed to the elements and the animals that came to feast. Decomposition in the desert heat is rapid and vicious, erasing evidence, complicating identification, making it easier for authorities to claim the deaths were isolated incidents rather than pieces of a monstrous puzzle. The families of the vanished began organizing. Mothers who should have been planning quinceañeras instead learned how to file missing persons reports, how to pressure indifferent bureaucrats, how to search the desert themselves because no one else would. They formed groups with names that sound like prayers. Voices without echo, justice for our daughters, may our daughters return home. These women, mostly mothers, some sisters, a few fathers, became amateur investigators, forensic anthropologists, and activists out of desperate necessity. Paula Gonzalez became one of the faces of this movement after her daughter Sagrario's murder. She appeared on news programs holding photographs of her beautiful daughter, demanding answers from officials who offered only evasions and excuses. "Find out who killed my daughter," she pleaded to anyone who would listen. But the investigation into Sagrario's death went nowhere, lost in a bureaucratic maze of incompetence and corruption that seemed deliberately designed to ensure failure. The police responses ranged from negligent to actively hostile. Families reporting missing daughters were told to wait 48 hours, to wait 72 hours, to stop bothering overworked detectives with cases involving girls who probably ran off with boyfriends. When the bodies inevitably appeared, bearing signs of prolonged torture and murder, the authorities performed a grotesque dance of victim blaming. The murdered women were accused of prostitution, drug use, gang involvement, anything to justify the inaction, anything to shift responsibility from the killers and the system that enabled them onto the corpses of their victims. Reports surfaced of police losing evidence, contaminating crime scenes, refusing to follow obvious leads. DNA samples disappeared from storage. Case files went missing. Witnesses who came forward with information were ignored or intimidated into silence. The investigative failures were so consistent, so systematic, that many observers concluded they couldn't possibly be accidental. Someone powerful wanted these murders to continue. Someone benefited from the chaos and terror that gripped Juarez's working-class neighborhoods. By 1998, over 100 women had been murdered, and hundreds more were missing. The numbers vary depending on who's counting, and that's part of the horror. The victims became statistics, abstractions, numbers that different organizations tallied differently. The Mexican government insisted the death toll was lower than activists claimed. Human rights organizations maintained thorough records suggesting the reality was far worse than official numbers acknowledged. The actual truth drowned somewhere in between, along with the names and faces and dreams of girls who deserved better than to become disputed data points. The factories kept running. Young women kept arriving from the south, desperate for work, unaware of or unwilling to acknowledge the danger that saturated Juarez like humidity before a storm. The maquiladoras employed mostly female workers because they could pay them less, work them longer hours, dismiss them without cause. These facilities operated in legal gray zones, taking advantage of NAFTA trade agreements that made Juarez a manufacturing hub. The economic boom that enriched foreign corporations created a population of vulnerable young women living in shantytowns without proper lighting, without police protection, without basic infrastructure. The victims lived in colonias, makeshift neighborhoods that sprawled across the desert like open wounds. Houses constructed from pallets, corrugated metal, and concrete blocks. Streets of dust that turned to mud when it rained. No streetlights, no paved roads, no emergency services. Women walked home from bus stops through absolute darkness, kilometers of unlit paths where screams wouldn't reach anyone who cared. And the killers knew this. They understood the geography of vulnerability, the architecture of abandonment. They hunted in the spaces where society's gaze didn't penetrate, where the missing wouldn't be mourned by anyone with power. The international community began taking notice as journalists from the United States and Europe descended on Juarez to document what was being called the worst case of femicide in modern history. Documentary filmmakers, human rights investigators, and advocates brought global attention to the crisis. But attention didn't translate to action. The killings continued. The bodies kept appearing. The desert kept accepting its grim offerings. Theories multiplied as fast as the body count. Some believed a serial killer was responsible, one monster prowling Juarez's streets, selecting victims according to his twisted preferences. Others pointed to organized crime, suggesting that drug cartels were using young women for snuff films, for trafficking, for ritual murders connected to narco-satanic cults. Still others saw something more institutional, accusing wealthy businessmen, politicians, even American citizens of crossing the border to commit murders they knew would never be seriously investigated. What became increasingly clear was that whoever was responsible, whether one killer or many, whether narcos or businessmen or police themselves, they operated with absolute impunity. The message to the women of Juarez was unmistakable. You are disposable, your lives don't matter, your murders won't be solved, your families won't receive justice. The message to the killers was equally clear. You can do whatever you want here to whomever you want, and no one will stop you. By the turn of the millennium, Ciudad Juarez had become synonymous with femicide. The very word, femicide, feminicidio, entered popular discourse largely because of what was happening in this border city. Scholars and activists used Juarez as the prime example of what happens when misogyny, poverty, corruption, and violence converge in a perfect storm of horror. The psychological impact on the community was devastating. Parents kept daughters home from school, from work, from life itself, trying to protect them by making them invisible. But the killers adapted. They began targeting even younger girls, grabbing women from their own neighborhoods, in some cases apparently entering homes. The geography of fear expanded until nowhere felt safe. Trust disintegrated. Neighbors suspected neighbors. The social fabric of entire communities unraveled under the strain of knowing that your daughter, your sister, your friend could be next, and that when she disappeared, no one with authority would care enough to find her. The pressure on Mexican authorities to produce arrests, any arrests, grew unbearable as international condemnation mounted. The solution they devised was worse than the inaction it replaced: scapegoating. In 1995, police arrested Abdul Latif Sharif, an Egyptian chemist working in Juarez. Sharif had a criminal record in the United States for sexual assault and came to Mexico after serving time in a Florida prison. He fit the profile that authorities wanted: foreign, educated, with a documented history of violence against women. Police presented him as the monster responsible for the murders, the single source of evil that had poisoned Juarez. There was one catastrophic problem with this theory. Women continued disappearing and dying after Sharif's arrest. The murders didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. The same signature characteristics appeared on victims found after Sharif was in custody, behind bars, locked away from any possibility of direct involvement. The pattern didn't break. It intensified. 8 young women were found dead in November 1995 alone, months after Sharif's imprisonment. Their bodies bore the same marks of torture, sexual assault, and deliberate mutilation that characterized earlier victims. This should have prompted authorities to acknowledge they'd arrested the wrong man, or at least not the only man. Instead, prosecutors constructed an even more fantastical theory. Sharif was directing the murders from prison, paying gang members to continue killing according to his specifications. This narrative stretched credibility to the breaking point, but it served a purpose. It allowed officials to claim the case was solved while bodies continued appearing in the desert. The next scapegoats were members of a street gang called Los Rebeldes. Police arrested several young men from this group, claiming they were Sharif's hired killers. The evidence against them was thin, built primarily on confessions obtained through torture. Human rights organizations documented the abuse: beatings, electrical shocks, suffocation, threats against family members. The young men recanted their confessions, describing in detail how police had tortured them into admitting to crimes they didn't commit. But Mexican courts accepted the tainted confessions. The men were convicted and sentenced to long prison terms. The international community expressed skepticism, but Mexican officials insisted they'd solved the murders. The case was closed. The families of victims should be satisfied. Except the murders continued. In 1999, authorities arrested two bus drivers, Gustavo González Meza and Victor Javier Garcia Uribe, claiming they were responsible for recent killings. Again, the evidence was problematic. Again, the confessions appeared coerced. And again, the arrests did nothing to stop the disappearances. The bus driver theory had some surface plausibility. These men had access to young women traveling alone. They knew the routes through dangerous neighborhoods. They could offer rides that seemed safe before revealing deadly intentions. But the investigation was sloppy, the forensics questionable, and the timing convenient. It seemed authorities were simply grabbing whoever they could, sacrificing innocent men to create the appearance of progress while the real killers remained free. Human rights investigators began documenting a disturbing pattern. The Mexican judicial system was producing scapegoats rather than pursuing genuine leads. Witnesses who didn't fit the official narrative were ignored. Evidence that contradicted convenient theories was discarded or destroyed. Meanwhile, credible leads went uninvestigated. Multiple witnesses reported seeing young women being forced into vehicles by men who appeared to be police officers. Some victims' family members received information suggesting that local and federal police were directly involved in kidnappings. These allegations were never seriously investigated. When journalists pressed authorities about potential police involvement, they were met with hostility and sometimes threats. The corruption ran deep. Juarez had become a narco-state within a state, where drug cartels wielded more real power than elected officials. The Juarez cartel controlled vast swaths of the city, and law enforcement had been thoroughly infiltrated. Police officers worked as cartel enforcers. Evidence lockers were accessible to criminals. Crime scenes were contaminated or destroyed by the very people supposedly investigating them. This created a nightmarish situation where victims' families couldn't trust the police to investigate murders because the police might be the murderers. Women who disappeared might have been grabbed by men in uniform, men with badges, men whose job was to protect them. The predators wore the faces of protectors, and there was no one to turn to, no higher authority that wasn't also compromised. Several theories emerged about who was actually responsible for the murders, each more disturbing than the last. The serial killer theory suggested one or possibly several killers with similar patterns operating independently. This would explain the consistency of victim profiles and methods. Serial killers often have specific victim preferences and ritualistic behaviors. The long-term nature of the murders, spanning decades, supported this theory. But it didn't explain how these killers could operate with such complete impunity, unless they had protection from authorities. The organized crime theory posited that drug cartels were using young women in human trafficking operations, for the production of snuff films or as victims in narco-satanic rituals. The Juarez cartel was known for extreme brutality, and some of the murder victims showed signs of ritualistic killing. This theory explained the institutional protection. Cartels owned the police, but it didn't fully account for the specific patterns of victimization. The dark tourism theory suggested that wealthy men, possibly including Americans, crossed the border to commit murders they knew would never be investigated. Juarez had developed a reputation as a place where anything could be purchased, including the opportunity to kill with impunity. Some investigators believed that organized tours brought men to killing fields where victims were provided like party favors. This theory was supported by witness reports of expensive vehicles seen in areas where bodies were later found, and by the fact that some crime scenes showed evidence of multiple perpetrators. The most disturbing theory suggested police and military involvement at high levels. This wasn't just corruption or looking the other way. This theory claimed that members of law enforcement were the primary perpetrators, using their authority to abduct women, their knowledge of investigations to avoid detection, and their institutional power to frame innocent scapegoats when pressure for arrests became too intense. Evidence supporting this theory was circumstantial but compelling. Some victims were last seen being approached by men in police uniforms. Some bodies were found in locations that suggested intimate knowledge of police search patterns. Some cases showed signs of evidence tampering that could only be accomplished by people with access to investigative files and forensic facilities. Diana Washington Valdez, an investigative journalist who covered the Juarez murders for decades, uncovered troubling connections between suspects and powerful figures. Her research suggested that some victims had been trafficked to parties attended by wealthy businessmen and politicians. She documented allegations of snuff film production, of murder for hire, of a systematic exploitation network that treated young women as disposable commodities. But pursuing these leads was dangerous. Journalists who dug too deep received death threats. Activists who named names sometimes disappeared themselves. The families of victims were warned to stop asking questions, to accept the official story, to let their daughters rest in peace or else. Several key investigators and advocates were killed or forced into exile. Esther Chavez Cano, one of the first activists to demand justice for the murdered women, faced constant harassment and threats. Lawyers representing victims' families were attacked. Journalists fled to the United States after receiving credible death threats. The message was clear. Investigating the true nature of the Juarez murders was life-threatening. Powerful interests wanted the killings to continue, wanted the investigations to fail, wanted the truth to stay buried in the desert alongside the bodies. Abdul Latif Sharif died in prison in 2010, still claiming partial responsibility for the murders, but also insisting he'd been framed for killings he didn't commit. The truth of his involvement died with him, lost in a fog of coerced confessions, contradictory evidence, and prosecutorial misconduct. The convicted bus drivers and gang members continued maintaining their innocence from prison, their cases becoming causes célèbres for human rights organizations. Forensic experts who reviewed the evidence found it woefully inadequate to support convictions. But Mexican courts repeatedly denied appeals, unwilling to admit that the convictions had been political theater rather than justice. By 2005, more than 370 women had been murdered, and an additional 400 were missing. The numbers came from different sources: government records, activist databases, journalistic investigations, and they didn't agree. But they all told the same basic story. Hundreds of young women had been systematically murdered in Ciudad Juarez, and the killers remained at large. The failures of justice were so comprehensive, so systematic, that they couldn't be explained by incompetence alone. Someone powerful wanted these murders to continue. Someone benefited from the climate of fear and the systematic degradation of young women's lives. Someone had the influence to corrupt investigations, intimidate witnesses, and frame innocent men while protecting guilty ones. The question of who was less important than the certainty that they remained untouchable, protected by layers of corruption and complicity that extended to the highest levels of Mexican government. The mothers of Juarez refused to let their daughters become statistics. While police claimed cases were solved and politicians insisted the problem was exaggerated, these women, many of them poor, uneducated, with no political power or connections, launched one of the most remarkable grassroots movements in Mexican history. They called themselves the Madres de la Plaza de Armas, gathering weekly in Juarez's central square with photographs of their missing and murdered daughters. They held the pictures high, turning their children's faces into accusations. "Justice for our daughters," they chanted. "Not one more." Their presence was a rebuke to every authority that had failed, every official who had blamed their daughters for their own murders. Maricela Escobedo Ortiz became the face of this movement, and her story encapsulates both the courage of these mothers and the brutality of the system they fought against. Maricela's daughter, Ruby Marisol Freire Escobedo, was murdered in 2008 by her boyfriend, Sergio Rafael Barraza Bocanegra. Unlike many cases, this murder had a clear suspect, evidence, and even a confession. Barraza admitted to killing Ruby, burning her body, and disposing of her remains. But Mexican justice had a cruel twist waiting. Despite his confession, Barraza was acquitted in 2008 due to insufficient evidence. The court system that had convicted innocent men based on tortured confessions suddenly developed rigorous standards of proof when facing an actual murderer who'd admitted his crime. Maricela didn't accept this perversion of justice. She became an activist, appearing on television, organizing protests, demanding that Barraza be retried. She camped outside the governor's palace. She went on hunger strikes. She made herself impossible to ignore, transforming her personal tragedy into a crusade for every mother who'd lost a daughter to violence and impunity. In 2010, Barraza was finally convicted and sentenced to 50 years in prison. But before he could be transferred to federal prison, he escaped. Just walked out. Security failures, the authorities said. Nothing they could do. The man who'd murdered Ruby, who'd been convicted of her murder, was now free somewhere in Chihuahua. Maricela escalated her protests. She held a sit-in outside the Chihuahua State Government building in the city center, directly across from the governor's office. For months, she maintained her vigil, holding signs demanding justice, demanding that authorities recapture her daughter's killer. On December 16, 2010, as Maricela protested outside the government building, a gunman approached her in full view of security cameras and police officers. He shot her once in the head. She died instantly, murdered in front of the seat of state power while guards stood by and did nothing. The assassination was captured on security cameras. The footage shows Maricela sitting peacefully, then a man approaching, firing, and calmly walking away. Police officers are visible in the background. They don't pursue the shooter. They barely react. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens to women who demand justice. This is what happens when you refuse to stay silent. The murder of Maricela Escobedo caused national and international outrage. She became a martyr, her face joining her daughters in the pantheon of Juarez's victims. Protests erupted across Mexico. Human rights organizations condemned the killing as state-sponsored terrorism against activists. 2 years later, police killed Sergio Barraza in a confrontation. Some saw this as justice finally served. Others recognized it as convenient. Dead suspects don't testify about who helped them escape, who protected them, who ordered the assassination of the woman demanding their capture. The Mothers Movement, despite losing one of its most prominent voices, continued growing. Women like Norma Andrade, whose daughter Lilia Alejandra Garcia Andrade was murdered in 2001, took up the fight. Norma co-founded Nuestras Hijas de Regreso a Casa, May Our Daughters Return Home, and dedicated her life to demanding justice and supporting other families. Norma's activism nearly cost her life. In 2011, gunmen attacked her outside her home, shooting her 3 times. She survived, but the attack forced her to flee Mexico for the United States, continuing her advocacy from exile. The systematic targeting of activists revealed the true nature of the opposition they faced. This wasn't just negligence or bureaucratic incompetence. This was an organized effort to silence anyone who threatened to expose the truth about Juarez's murders. International pressure began mounting in ways that Mexican authorities couldn't entirely ignore. Human rights organizations brought cases to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. The most significant of these was the Cotton Field case, Campo Algodonero, named for the location where 8 bodies were found in 2001. 3 of those victims became the focus of the international case: Claudia Yvette Gonzalez, Esmeralda Herrera Monreal, and Laura Berenice Ramos Menares. Their families sued the Mexican government for failing to prevent the murders, failing to investigate properly, and violating the victims' human rights. The Inter-American Court heard the case in 2007 and 2008. The testimonies painted a devastating picture of systematic discrimination, investigative failures, and official indifference. Witnesses described how police refused to search for missing women, how evidence was lost or contaminated, how families were blamed for their daughters' murders. In November 2009, the court issued its ruling. Mexico was guilty of violating the victims' rights to life, personal integrity, and personal liberty. The court found that Mexican authorities had failed in their duty to prevent violence against women, to investigate murders properly, and to provide justice to victims' families. The ruling ordered Mexico to investigate the murders of the 3 women effectively, to implement policies to prevent violence against women, to train law enforcement on gender violence, and to pay reparations to the families. It was a landmark decision, the first time an international court had held a country accountable for gender-based violence and femicide. But compliance with the ruling was slow and incomplete. Mexico made performative changes, created new laws, held training sessions, issued public apologies. But the structural problems remained. The corruption continued. The murders continued. By 2010, the character of violence in Juarez had evolved. The The drug war escalated dramatically as rival cartels fought for control of smuggling routes. The city's murder rate exploded, making it briefly the most dangerous city in the world. More than 3,000 people were killed in Juarez in 2010 alone. In this environment of pervasive violence, the femicides became even harder to track. Women's bodies found in alleys or dumped in the desert were often classified as narco-violence rather than gender-based murder. Authorities lumped all killings together, obscuring the specific patterns of femicide that had characterized Juarez for decades. Some observers argued that the narco-violence was used as cover for continuing the systematic murder of young women. Others suggested that the cartels had simply absorbed the practice of femicide into their broader portfolio of atrocities. The distinction mattered for understanding the phenomenon, but for the families of the dead, the result was the same. Their daughters were still being murdered with impunity. Activists began using a new term to describe what was happening: feminicidio, femicide, to distinguish the gender-motivated murder of women from generic homicide. The word emphasized that these weren't random killings but targeted violence against women because they were women. The concept of femicide spread beyond Juarez to other parts of Mexico and Latin America, where similar patterns of violence against women were recognized and named. Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador all reported high rates of femicide. But Juarez remained the epicenter, the place where the phenomenon first achieved international notoriety. Artists and cultural figures began memorializing the victims. Ghost bikes painted pink were placed around the city, marking locations where women had disappeared. Murals appeared showing the faces of the dead, transforming them from statistics back into individuals. Musicians wrote corridos, traditional ballads, about the murdered women, keeping their memories alive in popular culture. The pink crosses became the most recognizable symbol of Juarez's tragedy. Activists painted them on black telephone poles throughout the city, marking sites where bodies had been found. The crosses multiplied across the urban landscape until they seemed to outnumber the living, turning Juarez into a memorial to its own failures. Documentary filmmakers produced powerful works bringing international attention to the crisis. Señorita Extravida by Lourdes Portillo, Border Town, starring Jennifer Lopez and Antonio Banderas, though fictionalized, and numerous journalistic documentaries exposed the horrors to global audiences. But attention didn't equal change. The mechanisms of impunity were too deeply entrenched. The economic interests benefiting from Juarez's cheap labor were too powerful. The corruption was too pervasive. The misogyny was too fundamental to the culture. Observers noted that the victims were almost exclusively working-class women. Daughters of wealthy families didn't disappear from the streets of Juarez. The violence was class-specific as well as gender-specific, targeting the most vulnerable, the most disposable members of society. The maquiladoras continued operating, employing hundreds of thousands of young women in conditions that bordered on exploitation. The factories took minimal responsibility for their workers' safety, refusing to provide transportation, adequate lighting around facilities, or security in the colonias where workers lived. Some activists began targeting the corporations directly, demanding they acknowledge their role in creating the conditions that made workers vulnerable. Protests focused on foreign-owned factories, calling for boycotts and divestment. But the economic power of these corporations and their importance to the Mexican economy largely insulated them from accountability. By 2012, estimates suggested that more than 700 women had been murdered in Juarez since 1993, with hundreds more still missing. These numbers were disputed. Some claimed they were too high, others insisted the real toll was much higher, hidden by systematic underreporting and misclassification of deaths. The truth had become impossible to determine with certainty. Too many records had been lost or destroyed. Too many bodies remained unidentified. Too many missing women existed in limbo, neither confirmed dead nor alive. The chaos and corruption had succeeded in making accurate accounting impossible. What couldn't be disputed was that Ciudad Juarez had become synonymous with femicide, a cautionary tale about what happens when violence against women is tolerated, when poverty and misogyny intersect, when corruption destroys the possibility of justice. Ciudad Juarez today carries its history like a scar that won't heal. The city has changed dramatically since the peak of violence in 2010 and 2011. The narco war subsided somewhat as the Sinaloa cartel consolidated control over smuggling routes previously contested by the Juarez cartel. Murder rates dropped from their apocalyptic highs, but the femicides never stopped. Women continue disappearing from Juarez's streets. Bodies still appear in the desert. The methods have evolved, the patterns have shifted, but the fundamental dynamic remains. Young women, predominantly working class, are murdered with a frequency that exceeds statistical norms, and the investigations remain inadequate. Between 2015 and 2020, hundreds more women were killed in Juarez under circumstances suggesting gender-motivated violence. The pandemic years saw a spike in domestic violence murders as lockdowns trapped women with abusive partners. But even accounting for domestic violence, the rate of femicide in Juarez remains disturbingly high. The activism continues. Nuestras Hijas de Regreso a Casa and other organizations maintain their vigils, their protests, their demands for justice. The mothers are older now, their children's photographs fading, but their commitment hasn't wavered. New mothers join them, holding fresh pictures of recently disappeared daughters, perpetuating a cycle of grief and resistance. The pink crosses have become permanent fixtures of Juarez's landscape. Some have been maintained, repainted when they fade. Others have deteriorated, become graffitied, or been removed by authorities who find them embarrassing. Each cross represents a person, a life, a story that someone tried to erase. In 2021, a particularly brutal case reignited international attention. Debanhi Escobar, an 18-year-old woman from Monterrey, disappeared after being dropped off by a taxi driver. Her body was found 13 days later in a motel cistern. The investigation was bungled, evidence was contaminated, and the official explanation, that she'd fallen into the cistern accidentally, was widely disbelieved. While Debanhi's case occurred in Monterrey rather than Juarez, it demonstrated that the problems exemplified by Juarez's femicides had spread throughout Mexico. The pattern of violence against women, the investigative failures, the victim blaming, the impunity, all of it had metastasized. Mexico now has the grim distinction of recording some of the highest femicide rates in the world. Approximately 10 women are murdered every day in Mexico, with significant percentages of those deaths classified as feminicidios. The phenomenon that Juarez made visible has been recognized as a nationwide crisis. The Mexican government has responded with various initiatives. Special prosecutors for femicide cases were appointed. Training programs for law enforcement on gender violence were implemented. Laws were strengthened, creating harsher penalties for feminicidio and establishing protocols for investigating crimes against women. But laws on paper don't translate automatically to justice in practice. The corruption that enabled Juarez's femicides remains largely intact. Police forces throughout Mexico are underfunded, undertrained, and in many cases still infiltrated by organized crime. The judicial system remains slow, politicized, and prone to letting perpetrators escape accountability. Victims' families report that contemporary investigations often fail in the same ways investigations failed in the 1990s and 2000s. Evidence is lost. Crime scenes are contaminated. Witnesses are ignored. Cases go cold within weeks. The failures that made Juarez infamous continue to plague femicide investigations throughout the country. The impunity rate for murder in Mexico exceeds 90%, meaning fewer than 1 in 10 killings results in a conviction. For femicide, the rate is believed to be even higher. Women's murders are systematically deprioritized, underinvestigated, and underprosecuted. This creates a self-perpetuating cycle. Perpetrators know they're unlikely to face consequences, which emboldens them to commit violence. Families know that reporting murders will likely lead nowhere, which discourages cooperation with authorities. The lack of solved cases means less pressure on investigators to improve, which maintains the status quo of failure. Feminist movements in Mexico have grown increasingly militant in response to government inaction. Protests in Mexico City and other major cities have turned confrontational, with demonstrators spray painting buildings, breaking windows, and clashing with police. The The protesters argue that property damage is justified when women's lives are treated as less valuable than windows or walls. The chant "Ni una menos," not one less, originated in Argentina but was adopted throughout Latin America as a rallying cry against femicide. The slogan encapsulates a simple demand: stop killing women. The fact that this remains a controversial or difficult request reveals how deeply normalized violence against women has become. Young women in Mexico have grown up knowing the names of the disappeared, seeing the pink crosses, understanding that their gender makes them targets. This consciousness has produced a generation of fierce feminists who refuse to accept the violence as inevitable or unchangeable. Social media has become a tool for both awareness and accountability. Cases that police ignore can be amplified to national or international attention through platforms like Twitter and Instagram. Hashtags like #Anonymous and #JusticiaParNuestros trend regularly as new cases emerge. The digital age has made it harder for authorities to simply bury cases and hope they're forgotten. But social media attention doesn't guarantee justice. Viral cases may receive more investigative resources temporarily, but the systemic problems remain. And the attention span of the internet is short. Cases that dominate news cycles one week are forgotten the next, replaced by the next tragedy, the next outrage. For every case that receives attention, dozens occur in obscurity. Women are murdered in rural areas where there's no internet access, no journalists, no activists to amplify their stories. Their bodies are found and buried without their cases ever receiving the attention that might lead to justice. The economic factors that made Juarez's maquiladora workers vulnerable have evolved but not disappeared. The factories still employ hundreds of thousands of young women at poverty wages. The colonias where they live still lack basic infrastructure. Women still walk home through dark, unlit streets where predators wait. Globalization continues to demand cheap labor, and Mexico continues to supply it, primarily through the exploitation of young women's work. The supply chains that deliver electronics, clothing, and auto parts to consumers in wealthy countries remain built on the backs of women whose lives are considered disposable by the systems that profit from their labor. Some maquiladoras have implemented safety measures: shuttle buses, security guards, improved lighting around facilities. But these changes are inconsistent and often inadequate. Many factories still release workers late at night with no safe transportation, no protection, no acknowledgement of the danger their employees face simply by virtue of working there. The conversation around Juarez has expanded to include discussions of structural violence. Activists and scholars argue that the murders are the most extreme expression of a culture that devalues women's lives at every level. The femicides exist on a continuum that includes domestic violence, workplace exploitation, lack of reproductive rights, political marginalization, and economic inequality. From this perspective, solving the murders requires not just catching individual killers, but transforming the entire social structure that makes women vulnerable. It requires challenging machismo culture, redistributing economic power, reforming corrupt institutions, and fundamentally reimagining the value of women's lives. This is work that will take generations, if it happens at all. The forces arrayed against such transformation are powerful, not just criminal organizations, but legitimate businesses, political parties, cultural traditions, and economic systems that benefit from maintaining current power dynamics. The mothers who started protesting in the 1990s are elderly now. Many have died without seeing justice for their daughters. They pass the torch to younger activists, who continue the fight with the knowledge that they may never see resolution either. This is multi-generational trauma, multi-generational resistance, a battle that outlives the individuals fighting it. Some of the convicted men from the early scapegoat arrests remain in prison, still maintaining their innocence decades later. Their cases have become symbols of the criminal justice system's failures, not failures to protect women, but failures to deliver actual justice to anyone, creating victims and perpetrators indiscriminately through torture, false confessions, and show trials. The real killers, whoever they are, however many there are, remain largely unidentified and unpunished. Some are certainly dead by now. The murders have been occurring for over 30 years. Others likely continue operating, their patterns adapted to new circumstances, their methods refined by decades of practice and impunity. Theories about organized networks of killers have never been definitively proven or disproven. The evidence that might have established the truth was lost, destroyed, or never collected in the first place due to investigative failures. We're left with fragments, contradictions, and the certainty that something monstrous happened in Juarez, even if the exact nature and scope of that monstrosity remains contested. The forensic anthropology work continues. Teams still search the desert, still excavate remains, still try to identify bodies that were never properly processed when they were found years or decades ago. DNA technology has improved, allowing for identifications that were impossible in the 90s. Some families finally receive confirmation of deaths they'd known in their hearts for 20 years. But many bodies remain unidentified, stored in morgues or buried in common graves. Many missing women are never found at all, their fates unknown, their families trapped in a purgatory between hope and grief. The desert is vast and has swallowed countless secrets that will never be recovered. International human rights organizations continue monitoring the situation in Juarez and throughout Mexico. Reports are issued documenting ongoing femicides, criticizing government responses, making recommendations that are partially implemented or ignored. The international attention has forced Mexican authorities to at least pretend to care about femicide in ways they didn't in the 90s, but performative concern doesn't save lives. The Cotton Field case ruling by the Inter-American Court should have been a watershed moment. Instead, it's become another example of how international law lacks enforcement mechanisms. Courts can find countries guilty, can order reparations and reforms, but if the country chooses not to comply fully, there's little recourse. Mexico made token gestures toward compliance while the fundamental problems persisted. Ciudad Juarez itself struggles with its identity as a femicide capital. Tourism marketing emphasizes the city's cultural renaissance, its culinary scene, its vibrant arts community. There's an effort to rebrand, to move beyond the bloody reputation that defined the city for decades. Some residents resent the focus on the murders, arguing it overshadows the positive aspects of life in Juarez. But for the families of victims, for the activists who've dedicated their lives to demanding justice, the rebranding feels like erasure. Forgetting the murders means abandoning accountability, means letting the perpetrators and the systems that enabled them escape judgment. The tension between remembering and moving forward creates fractures within the community. Some former residents fled Juarez during the worst years of violence and never returned. The city lost population, lost businesses, lost a generation of people who couldn't raise children in a place where daughters disappeared. The exodus represented a vote of no confidence in authorities' ability or willingness to provide basic security. Those who remained or have since moved to Juarez navigate a complex reality. Life goes on, people work, fall in love, raise families, pursue dreams. But the shadow of the femicides never fully lifts. Every missing person poster, every unsolved murder, every pink cross is a reminder that the nightmare hasn't entirely ended. Young women in Juarez today have developed survival strategies their mothers didn't need. They share locations with friends constantly. They avoid certain areas certain times of day. They travel in groups. They carry weapons. They live with a level of awareness and caution that amounts to constant low-level trauma, attacks on their existence that men don't pay. This hypervigilance is exhausting and limiting. It restricts women's freedom, their opportunities, their ability to fully participate in public life. The threat of violence shapes their choices about where to work, where to live, where to go for entertainment, who to trust. The femicides didn't just kill hundreds of women. They circumscribed the lives of hundreds of thousands more. The psychological impact on survivors, both family members of victims and women who live with the knowledge that they could be next, is profound and understudied. Post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety, complicated grief. These mental health impacts ripple through communities but receive little acknowledgement or support. Mental health services in Juarez are inadequate to address the scale of trauma. Families of victims often can't afford therapy. Even when services are available, the stigma around mental health in Mexican culture prevents many from seeking help. People suffer in silence, their pain invisible but no less real. The children of murdered women grow up without mothers, often raised by grandparents who are themselves struggling with grief. These children, now adults, carry the legacy of Juarez's femicides into the future. Some have become activists themselves, continuing their mother's fights for justice. Others try to distance themselves from the trauma, seeking normal lives despite extraordinary circumstances. The literary and artistic responses to Juarez's femicides have produced important works. Roberto Bolaño's novel 2666 uses fictionalized versions of the murders as a central element, exploring themes of evil, complicity, and the failure of language to adequately capture atrocity. Sandra Rodriguez Nieto's journalistic work, The Daughters of Juarez, provides detailed documentation of cases and systemic failures. These cultural productions serve important functions, bearing witness, preserving memory, forcing confrontation with uncomfortable truths. Art becomes a form of testimony when official records fail, when the dead cannot speak for themselves, when those with power would prefer silence. But there's also discomfort around the aestheticization of femicide. Some critics argue that turning the murders into art risks exploiting the victims, turning their suffering into entertainment for audiences safely removed from the violence. The line between meaningful witness and voyeuristic consumption is difficult to navigate. The victims' families have complex relationships with media attention. They need publicity to pressure authorities, to keep cases alive, to find support. But they also endure repeated re-traumatization as they tell their stories over and over to journalists, filmmakers, and researchers. The emotional labor of advocacy is immense and rarely acknowledged. Some families have stopped cooperating with media, exhausted by decades of telling stories that don't produce justice. Others persist, believing that silence is worse than the pain of speaking. There's no right answer, only impossible choices made by people who've already lost everything. The question of how to memorialize the victims remains contentious. Some advocate for a large, central monument to acknowledge all of Juarez's murdered and disappeared women. Others prefer the dispersed pink crosses, marking specific sites where violence occurred. Some families want their daughters remembered as individuals rather than as part of a collective tragedy. Memory itself becomes political. Who gets to tell these stories? How should they be told? What details should be included or omitted? These questions don't have easy answers, and the disagreements reflect deeper tensions about ownership of trauma and the ethics of representation. The role of men in addressing femicide has been debated extensively. Some argue that men must take responsibility for male violence, must actively work to change the cultural conditions that produce femicidal attitudes. Others contend that centering men's participation risks redirecting attention and resources away from women's leadership. Male allies in Mexico have formed groups focused on challenging machismo culture, intervening when they witness harassment or abuse, and educating other men about consent and respect. These efforts are important but limited, cultural change is slow, and resistance to feminist messages remains strong in many communities. The economic dimensions of femicide continue to be underexplored in mainstream discourse. The murders in Juarez occurred in a context of neoliberal economic policies that prioritized corporate profits over workers' welfare. The maquiladora system created a disposable workforce of young women whose labor enriched foreign corporations while leaving them vulnerable to violence. Any serious reckoning with Juarez's femicides must include this economic analysis. The murders weren't just individual acts of misogyny, they were enabled by economic structures that treated women as exploitable resources. Addressing femicide requires not just law enforcement reform but economic justice. The parallels between Juarez and other sites of systematic violence against women are striking. The phenomenon isn't unique to Mexico. Similar patterns have been documented in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, South Africa, India, and elsewhere. Femicide is a global crisis, though it manifests differently depending on local cultural, economic, and political contexts. What Juarez contributed was making femicide visible and nameable. The activism that emerged from those mothers standing in plazas with photographs of their daughters created a template for movements elsewhere. The legal strategies developed through cases like Cotton Field established precedents that other advocates could use. But visibility alone doesn't stop murders. 3 decades after the Juarez femicides first gained international attention, women are still being killed throughout Mexico and Latin America at alarming rates. The awareness has grown, the movements have expanded, but the violence continues. This persistence suggests that femicide isn't an aberration that can be corrected with reforms. It's a feature of societies structured around gender inequality and violence. Eliminating femicide would require transforming fundamental power relations, redistributing resources, and dismantling cultural beliefs that have existed for centuries. The scale of that transformation seems overwhelming, even impossible. But the mothers of Juarez and the activists who followed them demonstrated that resistance is possible even in the face of overwhelming power. They couldn't save their daughters, but they refused to let those daughters be forgotten. They couldn't force justice from a corrupt system, but they created alternative forms of accountability through memory and testimony. Their fight continues in the bodies of younger women who take up the cause, who add their voices to the chorus demanding change. The outcomes remain uncertain. Justice delayed for decades might be justice forever denied. But the act of resistance itself has meaning. The refusal to accept violence as inevitable matters even when specific victories prove elusive. Ciudad Juarez remains a place of contrasts. Vibrant culture alongside pervasive violence, resilient communities alongside systemic dysfunction, hope for the future alongside unresolved trauma from the past. The city contains multitudes, refuses simple narratives, exists in tension with itself. The desert surrounding Juarez keeps its secrets well. Wind erases tracks, sun bleaches bones, time dissolves evidence. How many bodies remain undiscovered in that vast expanse of sand and rock? How many women disappeared into that emptiness, their fates unknown even to their killers? These questions haunt the city like ghosts. They shadow every sunset, every street corner where women wait for buses, every factory shift change when workers stream out into the night. The past isn't past in Juarez. It's present in every pink cross, every missing person poster, every mother still waiting for a daughter who will never come home. The story of Juarez's femicides doesn't have an ending because it hasn't ended. Women are still disappearing. Murders are still unsolved. Justice is still denied. The mechanisms that enabled decades of femicide remain largely intact, adapted to new circumstances but fundamentally unchanged. What we're left with is fragments, individual stories of loss and resistance, statistical approximations that can't capture the human cost, theories that explain some aspects while leaving others mysterious. We have the testimonies of survivors, the activism of families, the documentation by journalists and researchers who refuse to look away. We have the names: Alma, Maria, Sagrario, Ruby, Lilia, Claudia, Esmeralda, Laura, and hundreds more whose names appear in databases and on crosses and in their families' memories. They were daughters, sisters, friends, workers, dreamers. They were people with full lives ahead of them before those lives were stolen. They were women who deserved justice and never received it. Women who deserved protection and were abandoned. Women who deserved to be remembered as individuals but too often became statistics, symbols, cautionary tales. The desert wind still blows through Juarez, carrying sand across empty lots where bodies were found, rustling the memorial crosses that mark sites of violence. The factories still hum with machinery, employing thousands of young women whose labor builds products shipped around the world. The buses still run routes through dangerous neighborhoods, dropping off workers in the dark. And the mothers still gather in the plaza, holding photographs, demanding answers that may never come, keeping vigil over memories that refuse to fade. Their presence is testament to a simple truth. Some wounds don't heal, some debts can't be forgotten, and some women will never stop fighting for their daughters, even when those daughters are long dead. This is the legacy of Ciudad Juarez, not just the murders, but the resistance to forgetting. Not just the evil that was done, but the courage of those who refused to let it be normalized. Not just the dead, but the living who carry their memory forward into an uncertain future. The hunt for monsters continues. The monsters, protected by systems of power and privilege, remain largely unnamed and unpunished. But the women who refuse to accept this injustice, who transform their grief into action, who demand accountability even when it seems hopeless, they are the true story of Juarez. Their fight is far from over. Every day brings new challenges, new cases, new reasons to despair. But every day they also rise, they remember, they resist. In a city that tried to erase its daughters, they ensure that the daughters are never truly forgotten. The desert may hide bodies, but it cannot bury memory. The system may deny justice, but it cannot silence the voices of those who demand it. The powerful may escape accountability in this life, but history will remember. The dead women of Juarez will not be erased. Their names, their faces, their stories survive in the hearts of those who love them and in the work of those who fight in their names. This is their monument, not marble or bronze, but words and memory and the relentless insistence that they mattered, that their lives had value, that their deaths demand answers. In the end, perhaps that's the only justice possible when official systems fail. The justice of being remembered, of having your story told, of knowing that someone cares enough to refuse to let you disappear completely. The women of Juarez deserved better than the deaths they received, better than the investigations that failed them, better than the world that treated them as disposable. They deserved lives, futures, justice. They didn't get those things, but they have something else now. Witnesses who won't forget, advocates who won't stop fighting, and a place in history as both victims of horror and catalysts for a movement that continues to demand that not one more woman should die this way. Not one more. And I una más. The chant echoes through Juarez's streets, carried by voices old and young, tired and fierce, broken and unbreakable. It's a promise and a demand, a prayer and a threat. It's the sound of women refusing to accept that their daughters' lives don't matter, that their sisters' murders can be ignored, that their own existence is worth less than the convenience of the powerful. In the shadow of the desert, beneath the weight of decades of trauma, Ciudad Juarez endures. The story isn't finished. The mothers still stand vigil. The crosses still multiply. The fight continues. And somewhere in that ongoing struggle, in that refusal to surrender to despair or accept the unacceptable, lives the stubborn, painful, necessary hope that one day, somehow, things might finally change. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2, The Monster of Brussels. Some monsters don't hide under beds. They walk among us, smile at us, and wait for darkness to reveal what they truly are. Blood doesn't wash away as easily as people think. It seeps into floorboards, stains concrete, and lingers in the air long after the body is removed. The investigators who entered that Brussels apartment in 1995 could smell death before they even crossed the threshold. A thick, putrid sweetness that clung to their uniforms for days afterward. What they found inside wasn't just evidence of murder. It was a gallery of human suffering, carefully curated by a man who had turned killing into an art form. Junior Kabunda didn't just take lives. He dismembered them, scattered them, and transformed his victims into unrecognizable pieces of a nightmare puzzle. This is the story of how one man's descent into absolute darkness terrorized an entire city, and how the monster who smiled at his neighbors became Belgium's most notorious serial killer. Evil rarely announces itself with fanfare. It doesn't arrive with warning sirens or flashing lights. Instead, it moves quietly through the world, wearing human skin and practicing human gestures until the mask becomes almost perfect. Junior Kabunda understood this better than most. To the residents of Anderlecht, a working-class district in Brussels, he was simply another face in the crowd. A Congolese immigrant trying to build a life in a foreign land. He worked odd jobs, kept irregular hours, and maintained a polite distance from his neighbors. Nothing about him suggested the horror that festered behind his eyes. Born in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1971, Kabunda's early life remains shrouded in deliberate obscurity. He rarely spoke about his childhood, and when he did, the stories changed depending on his audience. Some accounts mentioned poverty and displacement. Others hinted at violence witnessed during Congo's perpetual conflicts. Whatever shaped him in those formative years planted seeds that would eventually bloom into something monstrous. By the time he arrived in Belgium in the early 1990s, seeking asylum and opportunity, those seeds had already begun to sprout. Brussels in the mid-1990s was a city of contrasts. The European Union headquarters brought wealth and prestige, but the outer districts told a different story. Immigrants clustered in affordable neighborhoods where questions weren't asked and anonymity came easily. Kabunda settled into this world like a shadow finding its corner. He rented a small apartment on the third floor of a weathered building where walls were thin and neighbors minded their own business. The perfect hunting ground for someone who needed privacy. The first disappearance happened in early 1994, though authorities wouldn't connect it to Kabunda until much later. A sex worker named Marie-Therese vanished from her usual corner near the Gare du Midi. Sex workers disappear with disturbing regularity in every major city, and Brussels was no exception. Police filed a missing persons report that gathered dust in an overflowing cabinet. No body, no crime scene, no urgency. Marie-Therese became another statistic, another forgotten face in a system that had already forgotten she existed. But Marie-Therese hadn't simply vanished. She had made the fatal mistake of accepting Junior Kabunda as a client. What happened in his apartment that night established a pattern he would follow with horrifying consistency over the next year. He strangled her slowly, watching the life drain from her eyes with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing an experiment. Death itself wasn't enough to satisfy whatever hunger consumed him. Once she stopped breathing, the real work began. Using a collection of butcher knives purchased from a local market, Kabunda methodically dismembered the corpse. He worked through the night, cutting through bone and muscle with practiced efficiency that improved with each victim. The apartment became an abattoir. Blood soaked into the cheap carpet and splattered across walls papered with fading flowers. He separated limbs from torso, head from neck, reducing a human being to manageable pieces. Then came the disposal, perhaps the most chilling aspect of his methodology. Kabunda didn't dispose of bodies in remote locations or bury them in forests. He scattered them throughout Brussels like grotesque breadcrumbs. A leg in a dumpster behind a restaurant, an arm in a plastic bag left at a bus stop, a torso stuffed into a suitcase and abandoned in an alley. He fragmented his victims both literally and geographically, ensuring that even if pieces were found, assembling them into a complete picture would prove nearly impossible. And for a while, his strategy worked perfectly. The second victim came 3 months later. Alphonsine, another sex worker, disappeared after telling a friend she had a client who paid well. That friend remembered the detail only after Alphonsine never returned. By then, it was far too late. Kabunda had refined his technique. The killing was quicker, more efficient. The dismemberment showed increased confidence. He had learned which joints separated most easily, which tools worked best for different tasks. He was getting better at murder. Throughout 1994, the disappearances continued at a steady pace. Kabunda targeted society's most vulnerable, sex workers, drug addicts, homeless individuals, people whose absences generated minimal attention. He selected victims who operated in shadows, whose lives were already defined by invisibility. When they vanished, the world barely noticed. Police received scattered reports of missing persons, but without bodies or evidence of foul play, investigations stalled before they truly began. The few body parts that surfaced created confusion rather than clarity. A decomposed leg found in March couldn't be connected to a torso discovered in May. DNA technology existed but wasn't routinely used for unidentified remains. Different precincts handled different discoveries, and information rarely traveled between departments efficiently. Kabunda's fragmentation strategy exploited every weakness in the system. He was hiding his crimes in plain sight, relying on bureaucratic inefficiency and societal indifference to shield him from detection. His neighbors noticed nothing unusual. The building's landlord would later claim Kabunda was a model tenant. Quiet, paid rent on time, caused no disturbances. If anyone detected strange odors coming from his apartment, they attributed them to cooking or poor ventilation. The sounds of activity late at night? Many residents worked odd hours. Brussels was a city where people minded their own business, especially in neighborhoods where asking too many questions could invite unwanted attention. But Kabunda wasn't merely lucky. He was careful. Between killings, he cleaned meticulously. He used industrial-strength chemicals to scrub blood from surfaces, though traces always remained in invisible crevices. He rotated disposal locations, never using the same dumpster or alley twice in succession. He varied the timing of his hunts, ensuring no predictable pattern emerged. This wasn't impulsive violence born from rage or passion. This was calculated, methodical slaughter executed by someone who had given considerable thought to the logistics of serial murder. By early 1995, investigators began noticing troubling patterns in missing persons reports. Too many sex workers had vanished from the same general area. Too many body parts were appearing in similar conditions of dismemberment. A young detective named Francois Dumont started compiling a file, cross-referencing dates and locations, looking for connections that others had missed. His superiors remained skeptical. Belgium didn't have serial killers, they insisted. Such horrors happened in America, not in civilized European cities. Dumont persisted despite the institutional resistance. He mapped disappearances on a large board in his cramped office, colored pins marking each missing person. He studied forensic reports from recovered body parts, noting similarities in dismemberment techniques. Someone with knowledge of anatomy, or at least access to sharp knives and the stomach for gruesome work, was operating in Brussels. The question wasn't whether a serial killer stalked the city's streets. The question was how many victims had already fallen before anyone noticed the pattern. The answer was more than anyone wanted to imagine. Junior Kabunda had killed at least 8 people by the time authorities began connecting the dots. 8 human beings reduced to scattered fragments, their identities obscured by decomposition and deliberate mutilation. 8 families left with agonizing uncertainty, never knowing for certain what happened to their loved ones. 8 lives extinguished by a monster who felt nothing as he carved through flesh and bone. What drove him remained unclear even to those who would eventually study his case extensively. Kabunda showed no signs of the sexual sadism that motivates many serial killers. He didn't torture his victims or prolong their suffering for pleasure. The violence was clinical, almost businesslike. Some psychologists would later theorize he was practicing a form of dehumanization, reducing people to meat, asserting ultimate control over life and death as a way to compensate for powerlessness in other aspects of existence. Others suggested his childhood in war-torn Congo had desensitized him to violence and death. Perhaps he had witnessed atrocities that normalized brutality in his developing mind. Perhaps survival in chaos had required suppressing empathy until nothing remained but cold pragmatism. These theories remained speculation. Kabunda himself offered little insight into his motivations, showing remarkable indifference to questions about why he did what he did. As winter gave way to spring in 1995, Kabunda's pace accelerated. The gaps between killings shortened. He grew bolder, more confident in his ability to evade detection. This evolution from cautious predator to brazen killer would ultimately prove his undoing. Arrogance creeps into even the most careful criminal eventually. The belief that they're too smart to be caught, too clever for conventional law enforcement, becomes a fatal weakness. Junior Kabunda was about to discover that monsters, no matter how careful, eventually make mistakes. The apartment building continued its mundane existence, completely unaware that a chamber of horrors operated within its walls. Children played in the courtyard below while, 3 floors up, a man cleaned blood from his bathtub. Neighbors prepared dinner while, next door, human remains waited for disposal. The banality of this evil, its proximity to ordinary life, would haunt investigators for years afterward. How could such atrocities occur in the middle of a populated city? How could no one see, hear, or sense the darkness festering in their midst? The answer was as simple as it was disturbing. People see what they expect to see. Junior Kabunda looked like everyone else, acted like everyone else, and blended into the urban landscape with practiced ease. The monster didn't announce itself because it didn't need to. It simply waited, patient and hungry, for the next opportunity to feed its inexplicable appetite for death. Understanding the full scope of Junior Kabunda's brutality requires examining not just the number of victims, but the specific nature of his violence. This wasn't killing for survival or profit. This wasn't even killing driven by sexual compulsion or rage. This was systematic dismantling of human beings, carried out with a precision that suggested disturbing familiarity with the process. Each murder followed a template, refined through repetition into something approaching routine. The victims entered his apartment alive and left in pieces, transported in cheap luggage and plastic shopping bags to various disposal sites across Brussels. The transformation from person to parts typically occurred over several hours, usually during the night when sounds were less likely to draw attention. Kabunda worked alone, requiring no accomplice to help with the gruesome labor. He had everything he needed: sharp knives, a bathtub for containing the mess, and an absolute absence of empathy that allowed him to saw through human flesh without hesitation. Forensic analysis of recovered remains revealed consistent patterns. Kabunda typically decapitated his victims first, separating the head from the body at the neck's base. This wasn't a clean cut. The process required significant effort with tools not designed for such work. The jagged nature of the wounds suggested sawing motions, back and forth through vertebrae and muscle until separation occurred. The heads were never recovered, leading investigators to theorize he disposed of them separately, perhaps weighted and thrown into rivers or canals where they would sink and decompose beyond recognition. After decapitation came dismemberment of the limbs. Kabunda removed arms at the shoulder joints and legs at the hips, displaying rudimentary but effective knowledge of human anatomy. He understood where to cut to separate appendages with minimal effort. The torso remained largely intact, though in some cases he further sectioned it into upper and lower portions. The internal organs showed signs of removal in several victims, though what he did with them remains unknown. Perhaps they went down drains or into toilets, flushed away like the humanity he had stripped from his victims. The physical evidence told a story of escalating confidence. Early victims showed more hesitation in the cutting patterns. False starts, multiple incisions at the same location, uncertainty about the best approach. Later victims displayed cleaner separations, more efficient technique. Kabunda was learning, improving his craft through practice. Each murder taught him something new about the mechanics of dismemberment, and he applied those lessons to subsequent killings with chilling pragmatism. Detective Francois Dumont's investigation gained momentum in March 1995 when two separate discoveries occurred within days of each other. A maintenance worker cleaning a canal near the Midi district found a plastic bag containing a human forearm, still wrapped in what appeared to be a woman's sleeve. The level of decomposition suggested the arm had been in the water for several weeks. 3 days later, municipal workers discovered a severed leg in a dumpster behind a shuttered factory. Forensic examination revealed both body parts came from different individuals, both female, both showing signs of violent dismemberment. The media finally took notice. Headlines screamed about a possible serial killer operating in Brussels. Public pressure mounted on law enforcement to solve the case before more victims fell. Dumont's superiors, previously dismissive of his theories, suddenly allocated additional resources to the investigation. A task force formed, bringing together detectives from multiple precincts to coordinate the search for what newspapers had begun calling the Brussels Butcher. The publicity changed the dynamic entirely. Sex workers and vulnerable individuals who normally avoided police contact began coming forward with information. Several women reported disturbing encounters with a man matching Kabunda's general description. African, medium build, soft-spoken, but with something off about him. One sex worker named Josette provided crucial details. She had accompanied a man fitting Kabunda's description to his apartment 3 weeks earlier, but fled when she noticed peculiar stains on his carpet and an overwhelming chemical smell that couldn't mask something rotten underneath. Josette worked with a police sketch artist to create a composite image that circulated throughout Brussels. The landlord of Kabunda's building recognized his tenant immediately and contacted authorities. Within hours, a surveillance team established observation positions around the apartment. They watched Kabunda come and go, following him to ensure he didn't claim another victim while they gathered evidence for a warrant. The waiting felt interminable. Every hour that passed increased the risk that he would kill again, but rushing in without proper legal authorization could jeopardize the entire case. On April 7, 1995, police executed a search warrant on Junior Kabunda's apartment. What they found inside transformed the investigation from theory into nightmare reality. The apartment was a crime scene of such magnitude that even experienced investigators struggled to process what they were witnessing. Blood stained every surface despite Kabunda's cleaning efforts. Luminol revealed handprints and splatter patterns covering walls, floors, and ceiling. The bathtub contained residue that testing would later confirm as human blood mixed with tissue fragments. But the most horrific discovery came from the kitchen. Inside the refrigerator, wrapped in newspaper and plastic bags, investigators found human remains belonging to at least 3 different individuals. Body parts stored like groceries, waiting for disposal at Kabunda's convenience. A large knife, freshly sharpened, sat on the counter alongside a hacksaw with biological matter still clinging to its teeth. The apartment wasn't just a murder scene, it was a processing facility where human beings were systematically reduced to disposable components. Kabunda himself was arrested several blocks away, walking casually toward a metro station. He offered no resistance when officers approached with weapons drawn. His expression remained neutral, almost bored, as they handcuffed him and read his rights. In the police vehicle transporting him to headquarters, he stared out the window in silence, watching Brussels pass by as if this were just another ordinary day. The disconnect between the horror he had created and his complete lack of emotional response would become a defining characteristic of his case. The interrogation lasted 3 days. Kabunda answered questions with unsettling calmness, showing neither remorse nor defensive justification. Yes, he had killed people, he couldn't remember exactly how many. 8? 10? The precise number seemed unimportant to him. He described his methodology with the same tone someone might use to explain a recipe. He selected victims who wouldn't be missed, brought them to his apartment, strangled them, then dismembered the bodies for easier disposal. Simple, efficient, practical. When investigators pressed him about motivation, Kabunda offered only vague explanations. He didn't hate his victims. He felt nothing toward them at all. They were simply there, available, and killing them satisfied some need he couldn't or wouldn't articulate. Psychologists who evaluated him found a man with profound emotional detachment, capable of understanding that society condemned his actions but incapable of comprehending why on any emotional level. He knew murder was illegal. He knew people considered it wrong. He simply didn't care. The physical evidence corroborated his confession in disturbing detail. Forensic teams spent weeks processing his apartment, cataloging every stain, every fiber, every microscopic trace of his victims. DNA analysis, still relatively new in criminal investigations, linked recovered body parts to specific individuals. Missing persons reports suddenly had answers, though the answers brought no comfort to grieving families. Learning that your daughter, sister, or mother had been murdered and dismembered by a serial killer doesn't provide closure. It replaces painful uncertainty with even more painful knowledge. The confirmed victim count eventually reached 11 individuals, though investigators suspected the actual number might be higher. Several body parts found throughout Brussels couldn't be matched to known missing persons, suggesting victims whose disappearances were never reported or whose identities remained unknown even in death. Kabunda's memory proved unreliable regarding specific details. He remembered the process but not the people. Each victim had become indistinguishable from the others in his recollection. Just bodies that needed cutting, parts that needed disposal. Media coverage exploded into a frenzy of horrified fascination. How could such atrocities occur in modern Brussels? How had this man operated undetected for so long? The questions implied criticism of law enforcement, of social services, of everyone who had failed to prevent these murders. Lost in the sensationalism was the uncomfortable truth that Junior Kabunda's victims were deliberately chosen from society's margins specifically because their deaths would generate minimal attention. He had weaponized societal indifference, and it had worked perfectly until random chance and persistent detective work exposed his crimes. Public fear gripped Brussels despite Kabunda's arrest. If one monster could operate undetected for years, how many others might be lurking in the city's shadows? Sales of security systems increased. Sex workers organized buddy systems and safety protocols. The comfortable illusion that brutal serial murder only happened elsewhere had shattered, replaced by the paranoid awareness that evil walks among us wearing human faces. The apartment building where Kabunda had lived became a macabre tourist attraction. People gathered outside, staring up at the third-floor windows as if they could glimpse the horror that had unfolded behind them. The landlord eventually evicted all remaining tenants and sold the property at a significant loss. Nobody wanted to live in a place where such darkness had festered. The building stood empty for years, gradually deteriorating into a hollow shell that perfectly symbolized the emptiness at the heart of Junior Kabunda's humanity. Meanwhile, investigators continued piecing together the full scope of his killing spree. They tracked his movements over 18 months, cross-referencing his known locations with unsolved disappearances and body part discoveries. The picture that emerged showed a predator who had moved through Brussels with methodical purpose, selecting victims, murdering them, and disposing of remains with consistent efficiency. He had created an assembly line of death, and only random chance had finally interrupted his production. The question that haunted everyone involved was simple yet unanswerable. How many more would have died if Josette hadn't fled his apartment that night? If she hadn't recognized him from the sketch? If the landlord hadn't called police? Kabunda showed no signs of stopping voluntarily. He had found a formula that worked, a routine that satisfied whatever dark compulsion drove him. Left uninterrupted, he might have continued killing indefinitely, accumulating victims until some other random chance finally exposed him. The Belgian justice system, renowned for its measured approach to criminal proceedings, found itself confronting a case that tested every principle of civilized jurisprudence. How do you prosecute someone who shows no remorse, offers no explanation, and seems genuinely indifferent to the magnitude of his crimes? Junior Kabunda presented a unique challenge, not a defendant claiming innocence or temporary insanity, but a man who freely admitted to multiple murders without displaying any emotional connection to his actions. The trial began in October 1996, 18 months after Kabunda's arrest. The delay resulted from the extensive forensic work required to build an airtight case. Prosecutors wanted no room for appeals or technical dismissals. They meticulously documented every victim, every piece of evidence, every link connecting Kabunda to the murders. The resulting case file filled multiple filing cabinets, representing thousands of hours of investigative work distilled into an overwhelming presentation of guilt. Kabunda's defense attorney faced an impossible task. His client had confessed to everything. The physical evidence confirmed every detail of that confession. No grounds existed to argue innocence or challenge the facts of the case. The only viable strategy involved arguing for diminished capacity, claiming Kabunda suffered from mental illness that prevented him from understanding the nature of his actions. It was a weak argument, and everyone in the courtroom knew it, but it represented the only path forward for the defense. The prosecution called a procession of witnesses whose testimony painted a portrait of systematic brutality. Forensic pathologists described the dismemberment patterns in clinical detail, explaining how Kabunda had systematically reduced human beings to component parts. The detached medical terminology couldn't fully sanitize the horror of what they described. Jurors listened with visible discomfort as experts detailed the amount of force required to sever a human head, the specific tools used to cut through bone, the likely sequence of dismemberment. Family members of identified victims provided emotional testimony that contrasted sharply with Kabunda's complete lack of effect. Mothers described their daughters, the dreams they had harbored, the lives cut short, the agonizing months of not knowing what had happened. Siblings spoke about the torture of uncertainty, the false hope that maybe their loved one would return, and the crushing finality of learning they had been murdered and dismembered by a serial killer. Kabunda watched these testimonies with blank disinterest, showing more reaction to a fly buzzing near his head than to the grief pouring from the witness stand. The most damning testimony came from the forensic team that had processed Kabunda's apartment. They presented photographs that the judge had initially wanted to exclude as potentially prejudicial, but ultimately allowed as necessary to convey the true nature of the crimes. The images showed blood-soaked carpets, stained bathtubs, and refrigerated body parts stored alongside food items. Jurors visibly recoiled. Several required breaks to compose themselves. One alternate juror requested removal from the case entirely, claiming she couldn't maintain objectivity after seeing such evidence. Kabunda's own testimony provided little illumination. Speaking through an interpreter, he answered questions with minimal elaboration. Yes, he had killed these people. Yes, he had dismembered them. Yes, he understood that society considered this wrong. Why did he do it? He offered only vague responses about feeling compelled, about it seeming necessary at the time. When pressed for deeper explanation, he simply shrugged. He had taken steps to conceal his crimes, dispose of evidence, and avoid detection, all behaviors indicating he knew his actions were illegal and would result in punishment if discovered. This awareness of wrongdoing and effort to avoid consequences demonstrated legal sanity, regardless of his emotional deficits. The trial's most chilling moment came during cross-examination when prosecutors asked Kabunda directly if he felt any remorse for his victims. He thought about the question for several seconds, then answered with disturbing honesty, "I know I should feel something, but I don't. They're dead. Feeling bad won't change that." The courtroom fell silent. Even hardened court personnel, accustomed to criminal proceedings, seemed shocked by such naked admission of emotional absence. This wasn't defiance or callousness. It was simple statement of fact from someone genuinely incapable of understanding why remorse should matter. The prosecution's closing argument focused on the premeditated, systematic nature of Kabunda's crimes. This wasn't impulsive violence or crimes of passion. This was calculated hunting of vulnerable victims, followed by methodical destruction of their bodies to hide evidence. The prosecutor characterized Kabunda as one of the most dangerous individuals Belgium had ever prosecuted, not because of rage or sadism, but because of his complete absence of human empathy combined with his willingness to kill for reasons he couldn't even articulate. The defense's closing argument asked for mercy while acknowledging the difficulty of that request. They argued that Kabunda's psychological abnormalities, while not legally excusing his crimes, should be considered mitigating factors. He was essentially a damaged human being, broken in fundamental ways that prevented normal moral development. Punish him, yes, but recognize that he operated from a psychological baseline so divergent from normal human experience that comparing him to typical murderers was meaningless. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The length surprised many observers, given the overwhelming evidence and Kabunda's confession. Later interviews with jurors revealed they hadn't struggled with guilt or innocence. That was obvious from the start. Instead, they grappled with understanding how to process a defendant so fundamentally different from any criminal they had imagined. How do you judge someone who seems barely human in emotional terms while being completely functional intellectually? How do you assign moral culpability to someone who appears incapable of moral reasoning? On October 23, 1996, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 11 counts of first-degree murder. The reading of each verdict took several minutes, with detailed findings connecting Kabunda to each specific victim through forensic evidence and his own admissions. He listened without visible reaction, his expression maintaining the same neutral blankness he had displayed throughout the trial. When the final verdict was read, he simply nodded slightly, as if confirming information he already knew. Belgian law had abolished the death penalty decades earlier, so Kabunda faced life imprisonment as the maximum possible sentence. During the sentencing phase, the judge addressed him directly, delivering a statement that would be quoted in newspapers across Europe. "You have committed acts of such profound evil that our justice system struggles to adequately address them. You took lives without reason, destroyed families without remorse, and treated human beings as disposable objects. Society must protect itself from individuals like you not through vengeance, but through permanent removal of the threat you represent. The judge sentenced Kabunda to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, Belgium's harshest available penalty. He would spend the remainder of his natural life in maximum security confinement, isolated from society he had preyed upon. As guards led him from the courtroom, victims' families erupted in tears, not of joy, but of exhausted grief. Justice had been served by legal standards, but no verdict could restore what Kabunda had destroyed. The people he murdered remained dead, scattered across Brussels in unmarked graves and unsolved mysteries. The trial's conclusion sparked national conversations about societal vulnerability and responsibility. How had Kabunda's victims, sex workers, addicts, homeless individuals, become so marginalized that their disappearances went unnoticed for months? What did this say about Belgian society's treatment of its most vulnerable members? These uncomfortable questions lingered long after the media spotlight moved elsewhere. Advocates for sex worker rights pointed to the case as evidence that criminalization and stigmatization created conditions where predators could operate with impunity. If society treats certain people as invisible and disposable, monsters like Kabunda will exploit that invisibility. The solution wasn't just better policing, it was fundamental reform of attitudes and policies that marginalized vulnerable populations in the first place. Law enforcement agencies conducted extensive reviews of their missing persons procedures. The Kabunda case had exposed critical gaps in how police handled disappearances of marginalized individuals. New protocols were implemented requiring more thorough investigation of all missing persons reports, regardless of the individual's background or lifestyle. Cross-jurisdictional cooperation improved to ensure that patterns spanning multiple precincts could be identified more quickly. Forensic science also advanced because of the case. The challenge of identifying dismembered remains and connecting scattered body parts to specific victims had pushed Belgian forensic capabilities to their limits. Investment in DNA analysis technology increased significantly, and Belgium became a European leader in forensic identification techniques. The victim's suffering had at least produced some benefit through improved methods for solving future crimes. The building where Kabunda had committed his murders was eventually demolished. No amount of renovation could erase what had happened there. The lot remained empty for years, a gap-toothed absence in the Brussels skyline. Eventually, a small memorial garden was created on the site, dedicated to victims of violence whose deaths go unnoticed and uninvestigated. Families of Kabunda's victims attended the dedication ceremony, finding small comfort in the acknowledgement that their loved ones mattered, that their deaths meant something beyond statistics. Prison officials reported that Kabunda adapted to incarceration with the same emotional flatness he had displayed throughout his trial. He followed rules, caused no disciplinary problems, and showed no interest in counseling or rehabilitation programs. He simply existed, day after day, in a small cell that would be his entire world until death. Psychologists who evaluated him periodically found no change in his fundamental psychological profile. He remained what he had always been, a void in human form, incapable of the empathy that makes us truly human. The question of why Kabunda killed would never be satisfactorily answered. He couldn't explain his motivations because he didn't truly understand them himself. Some darkness had taken root in him, whether through genetics, environment, trauma, or some combination of factors, and had completely consumed his capacity for human connection. He killed because it satisfied some need he couldn't articulate, and he felt nothing afterward because he was incapable of feeling anything at all. The conviction of Junior Kabunda closed one chapter but opened many others. The legal proceedings had answered the question of who killed 11 people in Brussels between 1994 and 1995, but deeper questions remained. What transforms a human being into someone capable of such methodical brutality? How do we protect vulnerable populations from predators who specifically target them because of their vulnerability? And perhaps most disturbingly, how many other monsters like Kabunda operate undetected because they choose victims society has already forgotten? The psychiatric community debated Kabunda's case extensively in professional journals and conferences. His complete lack of empathy, combined with functional intelligence and absence of obvious psychotic symptoms, represented an extreme example of antisocial personality disorder. Some researchers argued he demonstrated true psychopathy, not the Hollywood version involving charming manipulation, but the clinical reality of someone who literally cannot process emotional experiences the way normal humans do. His brain was structured differently, wired without the neural connections that create empathy, guilt, or emotional bonds with others. Neurological studies of incarcerated violent offenders had shown differences in brain structure and function, particularly in regions associated with emotional processing and impulse control. While Kabunda never agreed to brain imaging studies, researchers speculated that examination of his neural architecture would reveal significant abnormalities in the prefrontal cortex and amygdala, areas crucial for moral reasoning and emotional responses. Understanding these biological factors didn't excuse his crimes but provided context for how someone could commit such acts without apparent internal conflict. The nature versus nurture debate emerged inevitably. Was Kabunda born this way, or did his environment create him? His childhood in Congo during periods of intense civil conflict likely exposed him to significant violence and trauma. Developmental psychologists noted that children who witness extreme brutality during critical developmental periods sometimes fail to develop normal empathy responses. The brain adapts to its environment. If that environment treats violence and death as routine occurrences, the developing mind may never learn to categorize them as aberrations requiring strong emotional responses. But millions of people experience traumatic childhoods without becoming serial killers. The vast majority of individuals exposed to violence never commit violent crimes themselves. Something else, some combination of biological predisposition and environmental factors, had to explain Kabunda's transformation into a predator. Perhaps he carried genetic vulnerabilities that, in a different environment, would have remained dormant. Perhaps his particular experiences during sensitive developmental windows damaged specific neural pathways in ways that couldn't be reversed. The truth likely involved complex interactions between biology and environment that science still struggles to fully understand. The victims' families formed a support group that continued meeting years after the trial concluded. They found solace in shared experience, though the specific nature of their loved ones' deaths created unique trauma. Knowing that someone you cared about was murdered is one form of grief. Knowing they were systematically dismembered and scattered like trash compounds, that grief with layers of horror and violation. These families needed specialized support that generic grief counseling couldn't provide. Several family members became advocates for policy reforms addressing the marginalization of vulnerable populations. They argued, compellingly, that society bore partial responsibility for Kabunda's success. He had deliberately targeted people living on society's margins because he correctly calculated that their deaths would generate minimal attention. If sex workers had legal protections and support services that encouraged cooperation with police, if homeless individuals had resources that kept them from disappearing without anyone noticing, if drug addicts received treatment instead of criminalization, perhaps some of Kabunda's victims would still be alive. The Brussels Police Department implemented significant changes to missing persons protocols following the case. A dedicated unit was created specifically to investigate disappearances of vulnerable individuals, recognizing that these cases required different approaches than traditional missing persons reports. Officers received training on engaging with marginalized communities, building trust with populations that had historically viewed police as adversaries rather than protectors. The effectiveness of these reforms remained debatable, but at minimum they represented acknowledgement that previous approaches had failed catastrophically. Detective Francois Dumont, whose persistent investigation had ultimately identified Kabunda, found the case's conclusion brought little satisfaction. He had solved the murders, yes, but 11 people were still dead. More haunting was the realization that if he had pushed harder earlier, if his superiors had listened sooner, perhaps some victims could have been saved. Dumont eventually left police work entirely, citing burnout and disillusionment. The weight of those preventable deaths, the bureaucratic resistance he had faced while trying to save lives, became unbearable burdens he could no longer carry. The media attention surrounding Kabunda's crimes sparked uncomfortable conversations about society's consumption of violence. News outlets had competed to provide the most shocking details, the most gruesome photographs, the most sensational headlines. Critics argued this coverage exploited victims suffering for entertainment value while providing no meaningful public benefit. Defenders countered that public awareness served legitimate purposes, educating people about dangers, holding institutions accountable, ensuring such horrors couldn't be swept under carpets and forgotten. True crime as a genre experienced surge in popularity partly because of cases like Kabunda's. People displayed morbid fascination with serial killers, consuming documentaries, podcasts, and books that dissected their crimes in exhaustive detail. Psychologists suggested this fascination stemmed from multiple sources: the comforting belief that understanding evil helps protect us from it, the voyeuristic thrill of experiencing horror from safe distance, and perhaps the unsettling recognition that monsters look disturbingly human. Kabunda's ordinariness made him more frightening than any fictional villain. He proved that true evil doesn't announce itself with dramatic flair. It simply exists, patient and hungry, wearing an unremarkable face. Prison officials at the maximum security facility housing Kabunda reported that he remained a model inmate in the most unsettling way possible. He caused no trouble, followed every rule, and maintained perfect discipline. But his compliance stemmed not from reform or remorse, but from complete indifference. He didn't care enough about anything to misbehave. His cell contained no personal items, no photographs or decorations. He read occasionally but showed no preference for specific subjects. He ate what was served without complaint. He exercised when permitted. He existed in a state of profound emotional neutrality that disturbed even hardened prison staff accustomed to violent criminals. Other inmates avoided him instinctively. Prison populations typically develop hierarchies and social structures, but Kabunda existed outside these dynamics entirely. He wasn't feared or respected. He was simply irrelevant, a blank space that others unconsciously moved around. Even career criminals found something deeply wrong about him, though few could articulate exactly what triggered their unease. Perhaps humans possess some instinctive recognition of individuals who lack the fundamental qualities that define humanity. Kabunda's fellow inmates sensed the void behind his eyes and kept their distance. Psychologists who evaluated Kabunda periodically as part of his ongoing incarceration documented his remarkable consistency. Most prisoners show some psychological evolution over time, developing coping mechanisms, experiencing regret, finding religion, or at minimum adapting their emotional responses to confinement. Kabunda showed none of these typical patterns. Years of incarceration produced no visible change in his fundamental psychology. He remained exactly what he had been at trial, a functional human body housing something that couldn't quite be called a human soul. The unsolved mysteries surrounding his crimes continued haunting investigators even after his imprisonment. He thought about killing someone, and then he did it with no internal struggle or emotional aftermath. The philosophical implications troubled ethicists and moral philosophers. Western moral philosophy generally assumes that humans possess inherent capacity for moral reasoning, that even those who commit evil acts understand, on some level, the wrongness of their actions. But Kabunda seemed to represent a category of human existence outside these assumptions. He intellectually understood that society condemned murder, but he couldn't grasp why at any emotional or intuitive level. How do moral frameworks address individuals who exist outside the fundamental assumptions those frameworks are built upon? Religious communities struggled with similar questions. Traditional concepts of evil assume intentionality, that wrongdoing involves conscious choice to violate known moral principles. But Kabunda's crimes seemed to exist in moral territory beyond traditional sin. He wasn't rebelling against God or choosing evil over good. He simply operated from a psychological baseline so alien to normal human experience that conventional religious frameworks seemed inadequate to address his case. Was he evil, or was he something else entirely? A human body without a human soul, a thinking creature that never developed conscience? The families of identified victims found no comfort in these philosophical debates. For them, Kabunda's psychological abnormalities were irrelevant. Their loved ones were still dead, still brutally murdered and dismembered. Whether he killed from psychopathy, brain damage, or demonic possession made no difference to the fundamental reality of their loss. Academic discussions about the nature of his evil felt like abstract exercises that missed the concrete horror of what he had done. The actual lives destroyed, the actual grief inflicted, the actual harm that no amount of understanding could undo. As years passed, media attention faded. Kabunda became a historical footnote, a case study in criminal justice courses and psychology textbooks. New crimes captured public attention while he sat in his cell, aging into obscurity. But the families of his victims carried their grief daily, and the lessons of his case remained relevant for anyone working with vulnerable populations or trying to prevent similar predation. Belgium eventually implemented comprehensive reforms to sex work laws, creating legal frameworks that provided protections while maintaining public health and safety standards. These reforms stemmed partly from recognition that criminalization and marginalization had created hunting grounds for predators like Kabunda. By bringing sex work into regulated frameworks, reformers hoped to reduce the isolation and vulnerability that made sex workers preferred targets for violent criminals. Homelessness services also expanded, with increased emphasis on maintaining contact with vulnerable individuals and creating systems to notice when someone disappeared. While imperfect, these changes represented acknowledgement that society bore responsibility for protecting all its members, not just those living comfortable mainstream lives. The reforms came too late for Kabunda's victims, but perhaps they prevented future victims of similar predators. The demolished apartment building's memorial garden became a quiet place of reflection. Fresh flowers appeared regularly, left by people who remembered or by those who simply felt compelled to acknowledge the suffering that had occurred there. The garden's simple design, a few benches, some flowering plants, a small plaque listing the identified victims' names, provided space for contemplation about violence, vulnerability, and societal responsibility. Detective Dumont, despite his departure from police work, occasionally visited the memorial. He carried guilt about the victims he felt he could have saved with earlier action, though colleagues and therapists assured him that bureaucratic obstacles and institutional resistance bore more responsibility than his individual choices. Still, the what-ifs haunted him. What if he had pushed harder? What if his superiors had listened sooner? What if just one decision had been different somewhere along the chain of events? These questions had no satisfying answers. The past remained fixed and unchangeable. 11 people at minimum had died horrible deaths, their bodies desecrated and scattered, their humanity violated in the most profound ways possible. No amount of justice or reform could undo that reality. The only meaningful response was ensuring their deaths meant something, that lessons learned prevented similar tragedies, that vulnerabilities exposed led to protection strengthened, that their suffering ultimately produced some benefit for those who came after. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3, The Crazy Killer, the Nestor Pirat story. Some men don't break. They splinter into 1,000 jagged pieces, and every fragment draws blood. They called him the Crazy Killer, but madness was never his defense. Nestor Pirat didn't stumble into murder. He walked toward it with calculated precision, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives across Belgium that would haunt investigators for decades. This wasn't the work of a man who'd lost his mind. This was something far more terrifying. A predator who knew exactly what he was doing, who savored every moment of violence, and who believed the world owed him the right to destroy anyone who stood in his path. Between 1981 and 1987, Pirat transformed quiet Belgian neighborhoods into hunting grounds, turning ordinary encounters into death traps. His victims never saw him coming. By the time they realized the danger, escape was already impossible. This is the story of a killer who proved that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones who've lost their humanity. They're the ones who never had it to begin with. Nestor Pirat entered the world on March 15, 1933, in the industrial heart of Belgium, where smokestacks painted the sky gray and the clang of factory machinery drowned out childhood laughter. His arrival brought no celebration, no joy, only another mouth to feed in a household already buckling under the weight of poverty and desperation. The Pirat family lived in a cramped dwelling that reeked of damp concrete and unfulfilled dreams, where affection was as scarce as the money that never seemed to stretch far enough. From his earliest memories, Nestor understood that he was unwanted. His father, a brutal man whose hands were quick to form fists, viewed his son not as a blessing but as a burden. The beatings came regularly, without warning or reason. A perceived slight, a sideways glance, even silence could trigger an explosion of violence that left young Nestor cowering in corners. Tasting blood and swallowing tears, he'd learned never to shed in front of the man who should have protected him. His mother existed as a ghost in their home, her spirit crushed under years of abuse and hardship. She moved through their dwelling like a shadow, speaking in whispers when she spoke at all, her eyes hollow with a sadness so profound it seemed to seep into the walls themselves. She never defended her son. She never offered comfort when he nursed his wounds in the darkness of night. Survival meant keeping her head down, and in that household, love was a luxury none of them could afford. School offered no refuge. Nestor arrived each day wearing clothes that hung from his thin frame like rags on a scarecrow, carrying the stench of poverty that other children detected instantly. They circled him like wolves sensing weakness, their taunts sharp as broken glass. They mocked his appearance, his shabby possessions, the way he flinched when anyone moved too quickly near him. The teachers saw but said nothing, too overwhelmed by overcrowded classrooms to intervene in the daily cruelties that children inflict on those marked as different. But something was growing inside Nestor during those formative years, something dark and twisted taking root in the soil of neglect and abuse. While other children cried when hurt, Nestor began to observe his own pain with detachment, studying it the way a scientist examines a specimen under glass. He learned to divorce himself from feeling, to retreat into a space inside his mind where nothing could touch him. Animals became his first victims. He started small, trapping insects, pulling their legs off one by one, watching them struggle with a fascination that bordered on reverence. He graduated to larger prey. Neighborhood cats began disappearing. Stray dogs were found in alleyways, their deaths bearing the marks of prolonged suffering. When adults questioned him, Nestor's face remained blank, innocent. He was learning to wear masks, to hide the growing hunger that gnawed at him from the inside out. By the time adolescence arrived, Nestor had become a stranger even to himself. He watched other teenagers form friendships, fall in love, experience the fumbling joys of youth, and he felt nothing but contempt for their weakness. To him, human connection was a trap, emotions were vulnerabilities to be exploited. The beatings from his father had taught him that power was the only currency that mattered, and those who possessed it could do whatever they wanted to those who didn't. His first brush with the law came at 17 when a neighbor's prized rabbits were discovered mutilated in their hutch. The carnage spoke of rage and deliberation. These animals hadn't simply been killed but systematically tortured over what must have been hours. Suspicion fell on Nestor, but without concrete evidence, the police could only question him. He sat in that interrogation room wearing an expression of mild concern, answering questions with just the right mixture of confusion and cooperation. The officers let him go, but one detective's notes from that day would prove chillingly prescient. "This boy has dead eyes. Watch him." Nestor's 20s passed in a blur of menial jobs and mounting frustration. He drifted from one employment to another, never lasting long anywhere. Employers found something unsettling about him, though they couldn't quite articulate what. He followed instructions, showed up on time, and yet there was an intensity to his presence that made people uncomfortable. Coworkers avoided him during breaks. Women instinctively gave him wide berth when passing in hallways. His first marriage came and went like a brief, violent storm. The woman, desperate to escape her own troubled family, saw Nestor as a way out and realized her mistake within months. She never spoke publicly about what happened behind their closed door, but neighbors heard the screams, saw the bruises she tried to hide beneath long sleeves even in summer heat. When she finally fled, she left everything behind rather than risk returning for her belongings. She moved to another city, changed her name, and spent the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. By his late 30s, Nestor had accumulated a list of grievances against the world. Every perceived slight, every moment of disrespect, every person who'd looked at him with disgust or pity, all of it festered inside him, fermenting into a toxic brew of rage and entitlement. He began to fantasize about revenge, not against specific individuals but against humanity itself. In his twisted logic, he saw himself as someone who'd been pushed too far, someone who had every right to push back. The world had made him into a monster, he reasoned, and now the world would pay for its creation. Nestor started planning. He wasn't impulsive or reckless. That was the terrifying truth about him. He studied police procedures, read about other killers and their mistakes, learned how evidence could trap a careless man. He prepared himself mentally, desensitizing himself to violence through increasingly graphic fantasies that occupied his every waking hour and invaded his dreams. He acquired weapons, knives mostly, because guns were too quick, too impersonal. He wanted to be close to his victims, wanted to see the light fade from their eyes, wanted to feel their final breaths against his skin. He practiced in the woods outside town, perfecting his technique on animal carcasses, learning exactly how much pressure to apply, which angles caused maximum damage, how long it took for life to drain away. His fantasies grew more elaborate, more detailed. He imagined scenarios, rehearsed conversations, anticipated resistance, and planned how to overcome it. He chose his hunting grounds carefully, identifying areas where people were vulnerable, where screams wouldn't carry, where he could work without interruption. And then, in the autumn of 1981, Nestor Perrot decided the time for preparation had ended. He'd spent 48 years existing in a world that had never wanted him, never valued him, never given him the respect he believed he deserved. Now he would take what he wanted. Now he would make people notice him. Now he would prove that he was more powerful than all the people who'd ever looked down on him. On a cool October evening, as leaves skittered across empty streets and families sat down to dinner behind locked doors, Nestor stepped out into the darkness carrying his carefully maintained knife and a heart so empty of empathy it might as well have been a stone in his chest. He walked with purpose through streets he'd memorized during weeks of reconnaissance, heading toward an area where he knew people passed alone, where shadows offered concealment, where he could finally transform his fantasies into reality. The time for dreaming had ended. The killing was about to begin, and Belgium, though it didn't know it yet, was about to learn that some men don't just break society's rules. They obliterate them, leaving nothing but blood and terror in their wake. Nestor Perrot was ready to introduce the world to the monster it had created, ready to show them that the crazy killer was neither crazy nor accidental, but rather the inevitable result of a life soaked in violence and devoid of love. Ready to prove that the most dangerous predators are those who've spent decades perfecting their craft before claiming their first human victim. The nightmare was about to begin, and it would be far worse than anyone could imagine. Monique Delacroix was 23 years old when she became Nestor Perrot's first confirmed murder victim, though investigators would later suspect she wasn't truly his first, just the first they could definitively link to him. On November 12, 1981, Monique left her secretarial job at a textile factory in Liège at precisely 5:47 p.m., the same time she left every evening, following the same route she always took toward the bus stop that would carry her home to the small apartment she shared with two roommates. She never made it to that bus stop. Witnesses later reported seeing a young woman matching Monique's description. Auburn hair, green wool coat, leather satchel, walking along Rue de la Cathedral as daylight bled from the sky. One elderly shopkeeper remembered her passing his window, noted how she hugged her coat tighter against the November chill. That was the last confirmed sighting of Monique Delacroix alive. What happened next would only be reconstructed through the horrific evidence left behind in Nestor's own eventual admissions decades later, delivered with a casualness that made investigators' skin crawl. Nestor had been following Monique for 3 weeks, learning her patterns with the patience of a predator. He knew what time she left work, knew her route, knew exactly where the street lighting failed and shadows pooled deep enough to conceal violence. He'd chosen his ambush point carefully, a narrow passage between two buildings that served as a shortcut Monique took to shave 2 minutes off her walk. Those 2 minutes would cost her everything. He waited in that passage, controlling his breathing, feeling his pulse steady rather than quicken. Other men might have experienced adrenaline or fear or even excitement. Nestor felt only a cold certainty, a sense of inevitability. This was always going to happen. This was what he'd been building toward his entire life. When Monique entered the passage, Nestor moved with practiced efficiency. One hand clamped over her mouth, stifling the scream before it could form. The other arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet with strength born from years of manual labor. He dragged her deeper into the darkness, away from the street where someone might hear, might intervene, might rob him of what he'd waited so long to experience. The attack was brutal and prolonged. Nestor didn't simply kill Monique, he annihilated her. The medical examiner who later performed her autopsy would count 37 separate stab wounds, each delivered with deliberate precision. These weren't the frenzied cuts of a man out of control. They were methodical, calculated, designed to cause maximum suffering while keeping the victim conscious as long as possible. He'd started with superficial cuts, watching her eyes widen with terror as she realized what was happening, feeding off her fear like a parasite drawing sustenance from its host. He whispered to her as he worked, telling her she was paying for the sins of everyone who'd ever wronged him, that she represented all the women who'd rejected him, all the people who'd looked at him with disgust. Monique fought. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms testified to her desperate struggle to survive. She clawed at his face, leaving scratches that Nestor would later explain away as a work accident. She tried to scream, to plead, to negotiate for her life using the only currency she had: promises, apologies for offenses she'd never committed, anything to make him stop. But Nestor wasn't interested in negotiation. He was interested in dominance, in absolute power over another human being, in finally experiencing what it felt like to be the one who decided whether someone lived or died. And he decided Monique would die, slowly and painfully, in a filthy passage where her blood would soak into ancient cobblestones and her final moments would be witnessed only by the monster who orchestrated them. When it was finally over, when Monique's body had gone still and her blood had formed a pool around them both, Nestor experienced something he'd never felt before: a sense of completion, of purpose fulfilled. The emptiness inside him hadn't disappeared, but for those few minutes, it had receded, replaced by a dark satisfaction that was almost sexual in its intensity. He left her there, arranging her body in a deliberately provocative position, not because it served any practical purpose, but because he wanted investigators to know this killing was personal, intimate, a message written in flesh and blood. He walked away calmly, stopping at a public fountain to wash the most obvious bloodstains from his hands and clothes, then continued home as if nothing had happened. Monique's body was discovered the next morning by a postal worker taking a shortcut. The scene was so horrific that the man vomited before managing to call the police. Investigators arrived to find a crime scene that spoke of rage and sadism in equal measure. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a crime of passion. This was something far more sinister. The investigation stalled almost immediately. There were no witnesses, no forensic evidence that would prove useful with 1981 technology. No apparent connection between the victim and any known criminals. Monique had no enemies, no jealous ex-lovers, no dark secrets that might explain such savagery. She was, by all accounts, an ordinary young woman who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But for Nestor, there was nothing wrong about the time or place. Everything had gone exactly as planned. He'd proven to himself that he could kill, could get away with it, could cross the line that separated most humans from monsters. And more importantly, he'd discovered that he liked it. The weeks following Monique's murder were euphoric for Nestor. He walked through his daily life carrying a secret that set him apart from everyone around him. He was special now, powerful in a way they couldn't comprehend. When coworkers discussed the murder in hushed tones during lunch breaks, Nestor joined in, expressing the appropriate shock and disgust while internally relishing the fear in their voices. But the euphoria didn't last. Like any addiction, the high faded, leaving him craving another fix. The emptiness inside him returned, more voracious than before. He'd fed it once, and now it demanded more. 3 months after Monique's death, Nestor began hunting again. His second victim was Claude Fontaine, a 41-year-old postal worker whose only crime was crossing Nestor's path on the wrong evening. Claude was walking home after his shift on February 8, 1982, when Nestor approached him asking for directions. The moment Claude stopped to help, Nestor attacked with the knife he'd kept hidden in his coat pocket. This killing was even more vicious than the first. Nestor stabbed Claude repeatedly in the chest and abdomen, puncturing vital organs with a surgeon's precision. But he didn't stop there. Once Claude had fallen, Nestor continued his assault, mutilating the body in ways that suggested escalating sadism. He removed Claude's eyes with the tip of his blade, a detail that would later become one of his signatures. The symbolism wasn't lost on investigators when they finally connected the cases. The eyes, windows to the soul, organs of judgment and perception. Nestor was making a statement. His victims wouldn't judge him anymore. They wouldn't see him as less than human. In death, they were nothing, and he was everything. Claude's body was found in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The medical examiner counted 53 stab wounds. The time of death suggested Claude had been kept alive for hours, conscious through at least some of the ordeal. Blood spatter patterns indicated he'd been moved multiple times during the attack, suggesting Nestor had paused periodically, perhaps to rest, perhaps to savor his work before continuing. Police held a press conference warning the public that a dangerous killer was operating in the area. They released few details, hoping to avoid copycats and protect the integrity of their investigation. What they didn't say publicly was how terrified they were. The forensic evidence suggested they were dealing with someone who wasn't just violent but organized, patient, and utterly without remorse. 2 murders in 4 months. The pace was accelerating. The third victim came just 6 weeks later. Marie Dubois was a 55-year-old widow who volunteered at a local church, known throughout her neighborhood for her kindness and generosity. On March 24, 1982, she left evening mass and began the short walk to her home. Nestor intercepted her 3 blocks from the church, dragging her into a parked van he'd stolen earlier that day. What Nestor did to Marie over the next several hours would haunt the detectives who eventually saw the evidence. He transported her to a remote location, an abandoned farmhouse he'd scouted weeks earlier, and there, free from any possibility of interruption, he took his time. The autopsy would reveal over 100 separate injuries inflicted before death, a systematic dismantling of a human being that seemed designed to explore the limits of suffering. Marie's body was found by hikers 5 days later, partially decomposed and bearing signs of animal scavenging. But even the ravages of time and nature couldn't obscure the deliberate cruelty that had been inflicted on her. Investigators photographed the scene with shaking hands, some of them stepping outside to compose themselves before continuing their grim work. A pattern was emerging now, impossible to ignore. 3 victims, all attacked without warning, all subjected to prolonged torture before death, all left in positions and conditions meant to horrify whoever discovered them. The killer, now being referred to in police reports as Le Tueur or the Crazy Killer, was sending a message with every corpse. But what was the message? What did he want? Nestor could have answered that question, though he never would have articulated it the way psychologists later attempted to. He didn't want money or fame or recognition. He wanted to prove that the world's rules didn't apply to him. He wanted revenge against existence itself for the crime of making him suffer. He wanted to take the pain he'd endured and reflect it back 1,000-fold onto anyone unlucky enough to cross his path. Most of all, he wanted to keep killing, because in those moments when he held a blade and another person's life in his hands, Nestor Perrot finally felt like he mattered, finally felt powerful, finally felt alive, and he was just getting started. The body count would continue to climb, each victim adding another chapter to a story of horror that would eventually span 6 years and leave a community traumatized for generations. But even in those early days, as investigators struggled to identify the pattern and predict the next attack, one thing was becoming horrifyingly clear. They were hunting a predator who was smarter, more patient, and far more dangerous than anyone had initially realized. A predator who wasn't going to stop until someone made him stop. A predator who was rewriting the rules about how much damage one man could inflict on the world around him. Belgium had seen criminals before, but nothing like Nestor Perrot. Nothing that combined such cold calculation with such burning rage. Nothing that transformed ordinary streets into hunting grounds where death waited in every shadow. The killing had begun, and the nightmare was far from over. By the summer of 1983, terror had settled over Belgium like a suffocating blanket. 7 confirmed victims now, possibly more that hadn't been discovered or connected to the same killer. The media had seized upon the story, christening the unknown perpetrator the crazy killer, despite police objections that the moniker sensationalized the crimes. But sensational was exactly what they were: murders so brutal, so seemingly random, that they defied conventional criminal logic. Nestor Perrot moved through this landscape of fear like a shark through bloody water, energized by the panic he'd created. He read every newspaper article, watched every television report, absorbed the terror in people's voices when they discussed the murders. He'd become the center of attention in a way he'd never been before, and though no one knew his name, the power he wielded over an entire region was intoxicating. His 4th and 5th victims came within days of each other, an escalation that sent investigators scrambling to understand whether they were dealing with one killer losing control or multiple perpetrators. The truth was more disturbing. Nestor was becoming more efficient, more confident, and hungrier than ever for the rush that only killing could provide. Victim number 4 was Jean-Paul Mercier, a 32-year-old factory supervisor who'd made the mistake of working late on April 15, 1983. Nestor had been prowling the industrial district, searching for opportunity, when he spotted Jean-Paul locking up the factory gates. The attack came from behind, swift and overwhelming. Nestor struck Jean-Paul across the back of the head with a length of pipe he'd picked up earlier, dropping him instantly. But Nestor didn't kill him there. He dragged the unconscious man to his van. He'd learned that having transportation opened up possibilities, allowed him to take his victims to places where he could work undisturbed for as long as he wanted. He drove Jean-Paul to the same abandoned farmhouse where he'd murdered Marie Dubois, a location that was becoming his personal chamber of horrors. When Jean-Paul regained consciousness, he found himself bound to a chair in near total darkness, his head throbbing, blood crusting on the back of his neck. Nestor waited for him to become fully aware before beginning, wanting his victim to understand exactly what was happening, wanting to see the hope drain from his eyes as realization set in. The torture lasted through the night. Nestor used his knives with surgical precision, inflicting wounds that caused maximum pain without hastening death. He broke Jean-Paul's fingers one by one, snapping the bones with deliberate slowness. He carved symbols into his victim's flesh, not because they meant anything, but because he enjoyed the artistry of it, the way skin split and blood flowed in patterns he controlled. Jean-Paul begged, as they all did eventually. He offered money, information, promised silence if only Nestor would let him live. But Nestor wasn't interested in bargains. He explained this to Jean-Paul in a calm, almost friendly voice, telling him that this wasn't about money or revenge or anything rational. This was about power. This was about Nestor deciding when and how Jean-Paul would die, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing Jean-Paul could do to change that outcome. The end came near dawn, as gray light began filtering through the farmhouse's broken windows. Nestor slit Jean-Paul's throat with a single deep cut, then sat and watched as life pumped out onto the dirt floor. He stayed until the body was completely still, until he was certain death had claimed another victim, before cleaning his tools and driving away. Jean-Paul's body remained undiscovered for 2 weeks, giving Nestor time to hunt again. His 5th victim was selected with even less ceremony than the others, an elderly man named Albert Rousseau who happened to be hitchhiking along a rural road on April 23, 1983. Nestor picked him up, drove him to an isolated location, and killed him with an efficiency that suggested murder was becoming routine. The violence inflicted on Albert's body told a different story than efficiency, though. Nestor had stabbed him 78 times, continuing long after death had occurred. The body bore defensive wounds suggesting Albert had fought despite his age, had struggled against his attacker with the desperate strength of a man who knew he was facing his final moments. But what disturbed investigators most was the evident staging of the scene. Nestor had posed Albert's body in a seated position against a tree, arms positioned as if in prayer, head tilted skyward. It was theatrical, mocking, a deliberate message that the killer was playing games with them. He wasn't just murdering people, he was creating tableaus, turning his crimes into performances for an audience of horrified onlookers. The discovery of both bodies within days of each other sent Belgium into a full-blown panic. Parents kept children home from school. Women refused to go out after dark. Gun sales spiked despite strict regulations. The government deployed additional police resources, but how do you catch a ghost? How do you predict the actions of someone whose victim selection seemed entirely random? Nestor watched the chaos with satisfaction. He'd done this, transformed an entire region's sense of security into paranoid fear. For someone who'd spent his entire life being overlooked and dismissed, the feeling of wielding such power was better than any drug. But the euphoria never lasted. Within weeks of each kill, the emptiness returned, demanding to be filled again. Nestor found himself unable to focus on anything else, unable to sleep without dreams of blood and screaming, unable to function in his mundane daily life, because his real existence happened only during those moments when he held absolute power over another human being. His sixth victim was Françoise Laurent, a 29-year-old nurse who dedicated her life to helping others. On July 2nd, 1983, she finished a double shift at the hospital and headed toward the parking garage where her car waited. Security footage, grainy and nearly useless for identification purposes, showed a figure approaching her as she unlocked her vehicle. The next frame showed her car door hanging open, but Françoise was gone. Nestor had been watching the hospital for weeks, studying the patterns of employees coming and going. He'd chosen Françoise specifically because of her profession, because nurses represented care and compassion, everything he'd been denied as a child. Killing her was a way of destroying what she represented, of proving that kindness was weakness and that, in the end, violence always won. He took her to a different location this time, a rented storage unit he'd been paying for in cash under a false name. The space was soundproof, isolated, perfect for his purposes. What he did to Françoise over the next 36 hours represented some of his most sadistic work yet. The autopsy would later reveal evidence of sexual assault, prolonged strangulation and revival, systematic mutilation of extremities, and ultimately death by a combination of blood loss and organ failure. When Françoise's body was discovered in a dumpster 3 days later, partially wrapped in plastic sheeting that bore no traceable markings, the medical examiner broke down during the autopsy. This was her third victim from the same killer, and the escalating brutality was taking a psychological toll on everyone involved in the investigation. A task force had been assembled by this point, drawing investigators from multiple jurisdictions and even bringing in criminal profilers from abroad. They created a profile of the killer male, likely between 30 and 50 years old, with a history of childhood trauma and possibly previous violent offenses. The profile suggested he lived alone, held menial employment, harbored deep resentment towards society. They were right about almost everything except the most important detail. They had no idea where or when he would strike next. Nestor's seventh and eighth victims came in quick succession that autumn. On September 15, 1983, he kidnapped Marcel Dubois, a 47-year-old accountant, from a rest stop along the highway. Marcel's body was found 2 days later in a shallow grave, showing signs of having been buried alive and suffocating underground. A new method that suggested Nestor was experimenting, finding new ways to experience and inflict death. Victim number 8 was Simone Petit, a 62-year-old grandmother abducted from her own front yard while gardening on October 3, 1983. Neighbors heard a brief scream but assumed it was children playing. By the time anyone thought to check, Simone was gone. Her body turned up a week later in a drainage ditch, throat cut so deeply she'd nearly been decapitated. Each murder refined Nestor's technique. He was learning from experience, understanding better how to approach victims, how to transport them without detection, how to dispose of bodies in ways that delayed discovery and degraded evidence. He was becoming an expert at his terrible craft, a professional killer operating in the guise of an ordinary man. But cracks were beginning to show. Nestor had become increasingly reckless in his personal life, prone to angry outbursts that alarmed his coworkers. He'd been fired from 2 jobs for threatening behavior. Neighbors complained about strange smells coming from his apartment at odd hours. He was spotted in locations where victims had last been seen, though at the time, no one connected these sightings to anything sinister. The police net was tightening, though Nestor didn't realize it yet. Investigators were building a database of potential suspects, cross-referencing anyone with violent criminal records, anyone who'd been near multiple crime scenes, anyone whose behavior raised red flags. Nestor's name appeared on several of these lists, but he was one of hundreds of potential suspects. The task force didn't have the resources to thoroughly investigate everyone. By late 1984, the official body count attributed to the crazy killer stood at 9, though investigators suspected there might be more victims they hadn't yet connected to the same perpetrator. The fear gripping Belgium had reached fever pitch. Some families were moving away entirely, unwilling to raise children in a place where a monster prowled freely. Politicians called for resignations. The media ran endless speculative pieces about who the killer might be and why he couldn't be caught. And through it all, Nestor continued his terrible work. He killed a homeless man named Pierre in November 1984, mutilating the body so severely that identification took weeks. He murdered a hitchhiker named Thomas in February 1985, dumping the remains in a river where they weren't recovered until spring. Each victim represented another life destroyed, another family shattered, another addition to a legacy of horror that would haunt Belgium for decades. But Nestor had become addicted to the killing now, dependent on it in ways that went beyond mere psychology. His entire identity had become wrapped up in being the crazy killer. Without the murders, he was nothing again. Just another angry, middle-aged man that the world ignored. With them, he was powerful, important, feared. The addiction would be his downfall, though he couldn't see it yet. Because addicts always push too far, always take one more risk, always believe they're too smart to get caught. And Nestor Perrot, despite all his careful planning and cold calculation, was about to make the mistake that would finally expose him to the light. The harvest of horror he'd been reaping for years was about to come to an end. But not before he claimed a few more victims. Not before he proved once and for all that the monster Belgium feared was real, and far worse than anyone had imagined. By 1986, Nestor Perrot had been killing for 5 years, claiming at least 13 victims by conservative estimates, possibly more that were never definitively linked to him. He'd become a phantom haunting Belgium, a bogeyman parents invoked to keep children from talking to strangers, a symbol of randomized evil that could strike anyone, anywhere, without warning or reason. But phantoms eventually become flesh. Monsters eventually make mistakes. And Nestor, for all his careful planning and methodical execution, was about to discover that the perfect crime only exists until the moment it doesn't. His downfall began with victim number 14, though at the time, neither he nor the police knew this would be the beginning of the end. On March 8, 1986, Nestor abducted a young woman named Isabelle Moreau as she left a library in central Brussels. The attack followed his usual pattern. Swift approach, overwhelming force, quick transport to a prepared location where he could work without interruption. What Nestor didn't know was that Isabelle's boyfriend had been waiting to pick her up, had seen her exit the library, and had witnessed the abduction from his car half a block away. For crucial seconds, he sat frozen, his mind unable to process what his eyes were seeing. By the time he recovered enough to act, Nestor's van was already pulling away. But the boyfriend had the presence of mind to memorize the license plate number. Within minutes, police had a description of the vehicle and were broadcasting an alert to every unit in the area. For the first time in 5 years, the crazy killer had been seen in the act, and law enforcement had a tangible lead to follow. The license plate traced back to a van reported stolen 3 weeks earlier from a parking lot in Liège. The theft had seemed unremarkable at the time, just another property crime in a city full of them. Now it was the thread that would unravel everything Nestor had built. Investigators pulled security footage from businesses near where the van had been stolen. They cross-referenced the timestamps with traffic cameras in the area. They built a timeline, a map, a web of circumstantial evidence that began to point in a specific direction. And that direction led toward a middle-aged man named Nestor Perrot, who lived alone in a shabby apartment and had a history of disturbing behavior that had raised flags but never quite crossed the line into actionable suspicion. While police worked to build their case, Isabel Moreau endured hell. Nestor had taken her to an abandoned warehouse he'd been using as his latest killing ground, a cavernous space where her screams echoed off concrete walls and went unheard by anyone who might have helped. He kept her alive for 3 days, torturing her with a creativity born from years of practice and a complete absence of empathy. The injuries inflicted on Isabel during those 72 hours would fill pages of medical documentation. Broken bones, burns from heated metal, cuts that mapped her body like grotesque geography. But Isabel possessed something Nestor's other victims hadn't: the knowledge that someone had witnessed her abduction, that police might be looking for her, that there was still a chance of rescue however slim. That hope kept her conscious, kept her fighting, kept her engaged with her captor in ways that would later prove crucial. She talked to him, asked questions, tried to understand the mind of the monster who held her life in his hands. And Nestor, starved for genuine human interaction even as he inflicted inhuman cruelty, responded. He told her about his childhood, about the beatings and the neglect and the isolation that had shaped him. He explained his philosophy, that strength was the only virtue, that the world belonged to those willing to take what they wanted, that morality was a cage designed to keep weak people docile. He described previous victims, providing details that had never been released to the public, confirming what investigators had long suspected, that many unsolved murders across Belgium were connected to the same perpetrator. Isabel absorbed every word, committing details to memory even as pain threatened to overwhelm her consciousness. She understood instinctively that if she somehow survived, what she was learning could help catch him. And if she didn't survive, perhaps her body would tell investigators enough to finally stop him from hurting anyone else. On the 3rd day of her captivity, March 11, 1986, police executed a search warrant on Nestor Pirat's apartment. What they found inside painted a portrait of obsession and depravity that exceeded their worst expectations. Newspaper clippings about the murders covered entire walls, some with Nestor's handwritten annotations critiquing media coverage. Photographs of potential victims, people he'd been stalking, cataloging, preparing to hunt. And most damning of all, a locked trunk containing trophies taken from his victims. Jewelry, identification cards, scraps of clothing stained with dried blood. The forensic team worked through the night, documenting everything, building an airtight case against a man who'd evaded capture for years. But even as they cataloged evidence, one question haunted everyone involved. Where was he now? Where was his latest victim? Nestor had no idea law enforcement was closing in. He'd left Isabel tied in the warehouse while he went to purchase supplies, planning to continue his work through the night. He returned to find his captive exactly where he'd left her, weakened but still alive, still watching him with eyes that held defiance even through the pain. He was preparing his knives when police stormed the warehouse. The raid was executed with military precision. Flashbang grenades first to disorient, then a flood of officers equipped with tactical gear and weapons drawn. Nestor barely had time to process what was happening before he was face down on the concrete, hands being zip-tied behind his back, officers screaming commands that blended into a cacophony of rage and authority. Isabel Moreau was rushed to the hospital with injuries so severe that doctors weren't certain she would survive. She'd lost significant blood, several fingers were broken beyond surgical repair, and the psychological trauma would require years of treatment. But she was alive, the first person to be taken by the crazy killer and live to identify him. Her testimony would prove devastating. Over multiple interviews conducted from her hospital bed, Isabel provided details that connected Nestor to at least 9 murders definitively, with strong circumstantial evidence linking him to several more. She described how he'd bragged about his victims, how he'd demonstrated techniques he'd perfected over years of killing, how he'd explained his evolution from his first clumsy murder to his latest refined work. Nestor's interrogation began on March 12, 1986, and lasted for weeks. Initially, he maintained his innocence, claiming the evidence in his apartment had been planted, that he'd never hurt anyone, that this was all a terrible mistake. But as investigators presented piece after piece of irrefutable evidence, forensic matches linking him to crime scenes, witness testimony placing him near abduction sites, his own recorded confessions to Isabel, his facade crumbled. When he finally began talking, it was as if a dam had burst. Nestor confessed to 14 murders, described each one in meticulous detail, seemed almost proud of his work. He walked investigators through his methodology, explaining how he selected victims, how he avoided detection, how he'd managed to operate for so long without being caught. There was no remorse in his voice, no recognition that he'd done anything morally wrong. He spoke about killing human beings the way a craftsman might discuss perfecting his trade. The confirmed victim count stood at 14, though Nestor hinted there might be more, victims whose bodies were never found, murders committed before he'd settled into his pattern, crimes in other jurisdictions that police hadn't connected to Belgium's killer. When pressed for details about these potential additional victims, Nestor would only smile, savoring the power of secrets he'd carry to his grave. His trial became a media sensation that gripped Belgium and captured international attention. Courtrooms were packed with journalists, victims' families, and citizens desperate to understand how such evil could exist. Nestor sat through proceedings with an expression of mild interest, as if he were attending a play about someone else's life rather than facing judgment for his own horrific crimes. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Crime scene photographs that made jurors weep. Forensic testimony linking Nestor to multiple murder sites. The testimony of Isabelle Moreau, delivered via video link because she couldn't bear to be in the same room as her tormentor. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity, suggesting that anyone who committed such crimes must be insane by definition. But psychiatric evaluations told a different story. Nestor understood right from wrong. He knew his actions were illegal and would result in punishment if caught. He'd taken deliberate steps to avoid detection, demonstrating clear understanding of consequences. His crimes weren't the product of delusion or psychotic break. They were the calculated acts of a man who'd chosen violence, who'd embraced monstrosity, who'd decided that other people's lives meant nothing compared to his own desires. The diagnosis was antisocial personality disorder, but labels couldn't capture the full scope of what Nestor represented. He was a predator who'd spent decades perfecting his craft, a killer who'd elevated murder into a twisted art form, a man so fundamentally broken that rehabilitation was impossible. On November 17, 1987, after weeks of testimony and days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on 14 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of kidnapping, torture, and sexual assault. The judge sentenced Nestor to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, though Belgium's lack of a death penalty meant he would spend decades living at taxpayer expense in a prison cell rather than facing the ultimate consequences victims had suffered. Families of the victims provided impact statements that painted heartbreaking portraits of lives stolen, futures erased, communities traumatized. A mother described how she still set a place at the table for her murdered daughter years after her death. A widower explained that he'd never remarried, couldn't bring himself to love again after losing his wife to such senseless violence. A child who'd lost their parents spoke about nightmares that persisted years later, about jumping at shadows, about a fundamental loss of innocence that could never be recovered. Nestor listened to these testimonies without visible emotion. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, he declined. He had nothing to say to them, no apologies to offer, no explanations that would make sense to people whose moral frameworks he'd never shared. In prison, Nestor became a subject of intense study by criminologists and psychologists seeking to understand what creates such complete moral vacancy. He granted occasional interviews over the years, speaking about his crimes with clinical detachment that disturbed even seasoned professionals. He expressed no regret for what he'd done, no empathy for his victims, no wish that things had been different. When asked why he'd killed, Nestor's answers varied but carried consistent themes. The world had made him suffer, so he'd made the world suffer in return. People were weak and deserved to be dominated by those strong enough to take what they wanted. He'd enjoyed killing, found it fulfilling in ways that normal life never had been. The simplest answer, and perhaps the truest, was that he'd killed because he wanted to, because he could, because nothing inside him said he shouldn't. Isabelle Moreau survived her ordeal but was forever changed by it. She underwent years of physical therapy to regain partial use of her damaged hands. She spent even more years in psychological treatment, working through trauma that had rewired her fundamental sense of safety and trust. She eventually became an advocate for victims' rights, using her experience to help others navigate the aftermath of violent crime. She gave one interview about her ordeal a decade after the trial. In it, she described the 3 days she'd spent in Nestor's captivity as a descent into hell from which she'd barely escaped. She talked about the moment police burst through the door, about genuinely believing she was hallucinating because rescue seemed impossible. She discussed the guilt she carried for surviving when 13 others hadn't, the nightmares that still woke her some nights, the permanent scars both visible and invisible that she'd carry forever. But she also talked about resilience, about choosing life over death every day even when death seemed easier, about finding meaning in helping others avoid her fate. She transformed her trauma into purpose, her suffering into strength. She'd refused to let Nestor Perrot steal everything from her, though he'd certainly tried. The case had lasting impacts on Belgian law enforcement. New protocols were established for investigating serial crimes. Better coordination between jurisdictions was implemented. Victim support systems were expanded and improved. The lessons learned from failing to catch Nestor sooner were codified into training procedures designed to prevent similar failures in the future. But the deepest impacts weren't systemic, they were personal. 14 families would forever have empty chairs at holiday dinners. Hundreds of people who'd known the victims carried grief that time could diminish but never erase. An entire generation of Belgians grew up with the crazy killer as the monster under their bed. The warning about stranger danger made horrifyingly real. Nestor Perrot remained in prison, aging slowly in his cell, his body weakening even as his mind remained sharp and utterly unrepentant. He received letters from disturbed individuals who saw him as some kind of anti-hero, missives he never answered. He was interviewed by true crime writers and documentary makers, conversations where he performed for cameras but revealed nothing genuine beneath the performance. In 2003, now 70 years old, Nestor granted his final interview to a journalist working on a book about Belgium's most notorious criminals. When asked if he had any final message, anything he wanted people to understand about him, Nestor considered the question carefully before responding. "I am what the world made me," he said, his voice still steady despite his age. "But I made myself into something the world would never forget. Every person who reads about my crimes, every mother who holds her child closer because she's afraid, every cop who stayed up nights trying to catch me, they all prove I mattered. That's more than most people can say." It was a statement of such profound narcissism, such complete absence of empathy, that the journalist struggled to formulate a response. This was a man who'd murdered 14 people and felt his only regret was that he'd eventually been caught. A man who measured his significance by the fear and suffering he'd caused. A man who'd lived 70 years on Earth without developing a conscience. Nestor Perrot died in prison on January 8, 2008, at the age of 74. The cause was heart failure, his body simply giving out after decades of confinement. His death was noted in newspapers but generated little public interest. Most people had moved on, found new fears to occupy their attention, allowed the crazy killer to fade from immediate memory into historical infamy. He left no estate, no family to claim his remains, no friends to mourn his passing. His body was cremated at state expense, his ashes scattered without ceremony. In death, as in life, Nestor existed as a cautionary tale rather than a human being. A reminder of how far a person can fall when every socializing influence fails, when trauma compounds into rage, when choice after choice leads down a darker path until there's no light left at all. His victims were not forgotten, though. Memorials were erected, scholarships established in their names. Their families continued to gather on anniversaries, supporting each other through grief that never completely faded. They were remembered as individuals, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, people with dreams and fears and loves cut short by senseless violence. The crazy killer case entered criminology textbooks as an example of serial predation, psychopathic behavior, and the challenges of catching organized offenders. Students studied Nestor's methodology, his victim selection, his escalation patterns. Profilers used his case to refine their understanding of what drove certain individuals to commit acts of extreme violence. But beyond the academic analysis and the case files and the true crime documentaries, what remained was simpler and more profound. 14 lives stolen. 14 futures erased. Hundreds of people whose lives were irrevocably altered by encounters with a man who decided other humans were objects to be used and discarded according to his whims. Nestor Perot proved that monsters are real. Not supernatural creatures from folklore, but human beings who've crossed lines that most of us can't even imagine approaching. He demonstrated that some people are so broken, so fundamentally lacking in the qualities that make us human, that they can inflict unimaginable horror without hesitation or remorse. His story serves as a reminder that evil exists, that it can hide behind ordinary faces, that it can operate for years before being exposed. It warns us to trust our instincts when something feels wrong, to watch for warning signs, to remember that the most dangerous predators are those who appear most normal. The final chapter of Nestor Perot's story isn't his death in prison. It's the ongoing lives of those he affected. Isabelle Moreau, who transformed her trauma into advocacy. The families who found ways to honor their lost loved ones while learning to live with grief. The investigators who never forgot their failure to catch him sooner and worked to ensure future monsters would be stopped faster. Belgium moved on, as communities always do after tragedy. New crimes captured headlines. New fears replaced old ones. The passage of time softened the immediate terror that had once gripped the nation. But in quiet moments, in conversations between parents and children about staying safe, in police academies where new investigators learn about famous cases, in the hearts of those who loved the victims, in all these places, the story of the crazy killer persists. It persists not to glorify a murderer or sensationalize violence, but to remember what was lost and to honor those who suffered. It persists to remind us that vigilance matters, that community matters, that we have a responsibility to watch for those among us who might pose danger to others. And it persists as a testament to human resilience, to Isabelle's survival and recovery, to families who rebuilt their lives after devastating loss, to a society that refused to let fear win permanently. Nestor Perot wanted to be remembered. He wanted to matter, to be significant, to prove he was more powerful than the world that had dismissed him. In the end, he achieved a twisted version of immortality. His name will always be associated with horror. His crimes will always be studied as examples of human evil at its worst. But the real legacy isn't his. It belongs to his victims, who are remembered with love rather than fear. It belongs to Isabelle, who proved that survival is possible even after the worst imaginable trauma. It belongs to everyone who responded to his violence not with more violence, but with justice, with compassion for those hurt, with determination to prevent similar tragedies. The story of the crazy killer is ultimately a story about the worst and best of humanity, about how low we can fall and how high we can rise in response, about the darkness that exists in some hearts and the light that shines from others, about death and survival, fear and courage, destruction and resilience. Nestor Perot's final cut came not from his own hand, but from the simple failure of his heart after decades of confinement. He died alone, unmourned, leaving behind nothing but pain and cautionary lessons. His victims live on in memory, celebrated, honored, and most importantly, never reduced to mere statistics in a killer's tally. They were people. They mattered. They are remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. And that, perhaps, is the real ending to this nightmare. Not the death of a monster, but the enduring humanity of those he tried to destroy. The darkness he represented will always exist somewhere in the world. But so will the light that pushed back against it, that refused to let evil have the final word, that insisted on remembering the victims as human beings deserving of dignity and remembrance. That light burns still, a memorial flame for 14 souls and a promise that their suffering meant something, changed something, taught us something about protecting each other from the monsters that walk among us wearing human faces. This is the story of Nestor Perot, the crazy killer. But more importantly, it's the story of those who survived him, remembered him, and learned from him. Their story continues long after his ended, a testament to the truth that even the darkest chapters eventually close, even the longest nightmares eventually end. and even the deepest wounds can slowly, painfully, begin to heal. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Strangler of Vienna. She kissed her victims before she killed them, a tender embrace that turned into their final breath. 23 bodies. 1 woman. 0 remorse. We spend our lives fearing the darkness outside our doors, never realizing that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one who tucks you into bed. Tonight, we descend into the twisted mind of Leopoldine Kasparek, a woman who turned mercy into murder, compassion into carnage, and the sacred trust between caregiver and patient into Austria's most horrifying killing spree. This is the story of how Vienna's angel of death hid in plain sight, her hands both healing and destroying, while an entire city slept soundly, unaware that their elderly were being hunted in their own beds. Vienna, 1920s. The city was still bleeding from the Great War, its streets filled with ghosts of young men who never came home and widows who wore black like a second skin. The empire had crumbled, leaving behind a landscape of shattered dreams and broken families. Food was scarce, hope was scarcer, and in the cramped, shadowy apartments of the city's poorest districts, people learned to survive by any means necessary. Leopoldine Kasparek was born into this world of ash and desperation on March 18, 1894, in the working-class neighborhood of Ottakring. Her childhood was painted in shades of gray. A drunken father whose fists spoke louder than words, a mother worn down to the bone by poverty and childbearing, and siblings who competed for scraps of food and affection. The apartment they called home was a suffocating maze of 3 rooms shared by 8 people, where privacy was a luxury and violence was the common language. From her earliest memories, Leopoldine learned that the world was not kind to girls like her. Pretty enough to attract attention but poor enough to be dismissed, she watched as opportunities that should have been hers were handed to others born into better circumstances. Her father, a laborer whose wages were drunk away before reaching home, made it clear that daughters were burdens, mouths to feed until some man could be convinced to take them off his hands. School was a brief escape, but even there, Leopoldine found herself on the outside. The other children mocked her threadbare dresses and the smell of cabbage that clung to her skin. Teachers overlooked her raised hand, their attention gravitating toward students whose parents could afford to donate to school funds. She learned early that the world was divided into those who mattered and those who didn't. She belonged firmly to the latter category. At 14, Leopoldine's formal education ended. Not because she lacked intelligence, quite the opposite. But poor girls in Vienna didn't get to dream of universities or careers. They got to dream of survival. Her mother secured her a position as a maid in a wealthy household in the first district, and Leopoldine entered a world that seemed to exist in a different dimension from the one she'd known. The mansion where she worked was a cathedral of marble and mahogany, where single rooms were larger than her entire childhood apartment. She cleaned toilets made of porcelain so fine it seemed criminal to use them for such purposes. She polished silver that would feed her family for a year, and she watched the lady of the house throw away more food after a single meal than Leopoldine's mother could buy in a month. But what struck her most wasn't the wealth itself. It was the casual cruelty with which it was wielded. The mistress of the house treated Leopoldine as if she were furniture, speaking about her in the third person while she stood right there, invisible despite being in plain sight. The lady's children would leave messes deliberately, laughing as Leopoldine scrambled to clean them before their mother noticed and docked her pay. It was there, on her hands and knees scrubbing someone else's floors, that something hardened inside Leopoldine Kasparek. A cold, dark seed took root in soil already poisoned by years of humiliation and neglect. She didn't just resent these people. She began to study them, their vulnerabilities, their dependencies, the way they became helpless as infants when illness struck, suddenly desperate for the very servants they'd ignored when healthy. At 19, Leopoldine married Franz Kasparek, a factory worker who seemed like a ticket to something better. The marriage was doomed from the start. Franz drank like her father, hit like her father, and disappeared for days at a time like her father. But the union did give her something valuable: an escape from her parents' home and a legitimate reason to seek employment that would take her away from Franz's fists. She found her calling, if such a word can be used, in nursing. Not legitimate nursing, of course. Women like Leopoldine didn't get to attend proper nursing schools. But Vienna's hospitals and homes for the elderly were perpetually understaffed, desperate for anyone willing to do the unglamorous work of caring for the dying. No credentials were required, just a strong stomach and a willingness to deal with bodies in their most degraded states. Leopoldine proved exceptional at the work. She had gentle hands and a soothing voice. Patients relaxed under her care. Families praised her dedication. The way she'd volunteer for night shifts no one else wanted. How she'd stay late without demanding extra pay. She seemed born for the role of caregiver, patient, attentive, almost supernaturally calm in crisis situations. But beneath the surface of this Florence Nightingale facade, something else was happening. Leopoldine had discovered a secret. The dying were easy to kill. The old, the sick, the bedridden, they occupied a space where death was expected, even welcomed. Their bodies were already failing. Their minds were often clouded by pain or medication. And most importantly, no one looked too closely when they finally stopped breathing. Her first murder wasn't planned. Or at least, that's what she would claim later, though the truth of such claims is always suspect. She was caring for an elderly woman. A bitter, demanding patient who rang her bell incessantly, who complained about everything, who reminded Leopoldine of all the wealthy women who treated her like dirt. During one particularly exhausting night shift, as the woman berated her for bringing water that wasn't cold enough, something in Leopoldine snapped. She didn't consciously decide to kill. She simply didn't decide to stop. Her hands, which had been adjusting the woman's pillows, moved to her throat. The pressure increased. The woman's eyes widened, her hands clawing weakly at Leopoldine's wrists. But she was frail, her body ravaged by age and illness, and Leopoldine was young and strong from years of hard labor. It took less than 3 minutes. When it was over, Leopoldine arranged the body carefully, smoothing the nightgown, positioning the hands peacefully across the chest. She walked calmly to notify the doctor on duty. "I'm afraid Mrs. Hartmann has passed," she said, her voice appropriately somber. "Her heart, I believe. She'd been having palpitations all evening." The doctor barely glanced at the body. An elderly woman with a history of heart problems dying in her sleep? It happened a dozen times a week in Vienna. He signed the death certificate, offered Leopoldine his condolences on losing a patient, and moved on to his living cases. And Leopoldine Kasparek discovered something that would define the rest of her life. Killing was easy. Stunningly, frighteningly easy. Especially when your victims were society's forgotten. The elderly poor, the chronically ill, the ones whose deaths would be mourned briefly and then dismissed as natural, inevitable, even merciful. But more than the ease of it, Leopoldine discovered something else. She liked it, not in a frenzied, passionate way. She wasn't driven by sexual sadism or religious delusion or voices in her head. Her pleasure was colder, more calculating. It was the pleasure of power, ultimate, absolute power over life and death. For a woman who'd spent her entire life being powerless, being told where to stand and how to speak and whom to serve, this secret dominion was intoxicating. The wealthy families who'd treated her like subhuman garbage, their elderly relatives died under her care. The demanding patients who rang their bells and complained, they stopped complaining. The system that had ground her down since birth, she'd found a way to grind back. Over the next few years, Leopoldine moved from position to position: home care nurse, hospital aide, companion to the elderly. She never stayed anywhere long enough to attract suspicion, but she stayed long enough to kill. Her methods varied slightly, but strangulation remained her favorite. There was something intimate about it, something that appealed to her twisted sense of irony. These people who wouldn't have touched her in life except to hand her a dirty plate. She literally held their lives in her hands. She developed rituals, small, private ceremonies that made each murder feel special, chosen. Sometimes she'd kiss her victims on the forehead before killing them, a mockery of maternal affection. Sometimes she'd whisper to them as they died, though what she said remained her secret. And always, she'd arrange the bodies afterward with meticulous care, making sure they looked peaceful, natural, as if death had simply tiptoed in on gentle feet rather than being strangled into them. By 1924, when authorities would finally begin to suspect something was wrong, Leopoldine Kasparek had been killing for years. The exact number of her victims would never be fully known. She killed in an era before modern forensics, in a city overwhelmed by death, among a population of victims whose deaths seemed unremarkable. But conservative estimates would eventually place the number at over 20. 20 human beings whose final moments were spent looking up at the face of someone they trusted to care for them, only to realize, too late, that the hands around their throat weren't there to help. Vienna's working-class neighborhoods in the 1920s were a perfect hunting ground for someone like Leopoldine. Death was omnipresent, from tuberculosis, from influenza, from malnutrition, from the 1,000 other ailments that plagued the poor. People died in their beds regularly, and if those deaths occasionally seemed sudden or occurred in clusters around particular caregivers, well, who had time to investigate? The police were overwhelmed with real crimes. Doctors were overworked. Families were too relieved to be free of the burden of care to ask difficult questions. And so Leopoldine continued her dark work, moving through Vienna like a plague wind, leaving behind a trail of bodies that wouldn't be connected for years. She was the perfect predator, invisible, underestimated, operating in a space where death was so common it became wallpaper. But every predator, no matter how careful, eventually makes a mistake. For Leopoldine, that mistake wouldn't be forensic evidence or a witness or even her own carelessness. It would be something far more human: greed. The years between 1920 and 1924 marked Leopoldine Kasparek's most prolific period as a killer, though prolific seems an obscene word to use for murder. She'd refined her craft, if such a hellish skill can be called a craft, moving through Vienna's network of private homes, boarding houses, and small care facilities like a ghost. Her reputation as a devoted, tireless caregiver grew even as the body count around her mounted. The city itself became her accomplice. Post-war Vienna was a study in desperation, a once grand imperial capital reduced to a bloated head on a shrunken body after the empire's dismemberment. The population was aging, impoverished, and overwhelmed. The old and infirm were everywhere, often cared for in conditions that would horrify modern sensibilities. Single rooms housing multiple patients. Medicines that were little more than placebos. Caregivers with no training beyond a willingness to clean bedpans and change soiled sheets. Leopoldine thrived in this chaos. She became known in certain circles as someone who could be relied upon, someone who'd take the difficult cases no one else wanted. The violent dementia patients, the incontinent elderly who smelled of decay, the dying who screamed through the night. Families would hear about her through whispered recommendations. There's this woman, Leopoldine. She's a bit odd, keeps to herself, but she'll care for your mother when no one else will. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that hiring Leopoldine Kasparek was signing a death warrant. Her pattern was consistent enough to be predictable in hindsight, though at the time, no one was looking for patterns. She'd arrive at a new situation, usually hired to provide live-in care for an elderly or infirm patient. The first weeks would be exemplary. She'd be attentive, gentle, professional. The family would relax, grateful to have found such a treasure. They'd start leaving her alone with the patient for longer periods. Some would go on holiday, finally able to take a break from the grinding stress of caregiving. That's when Leopoldine would strike. Not immediately. She was far too clever for that. But within a few weeks or months, the patient would begin to decline. Small things at first: increased confusion, difficulty eating, trouble breathing. The family would be concerned, but Leopoldine would reassure them, it's the natural progression of the illness. I've seen it many times before. And she had seen it, though she'd caused it more often than not. The actual murders were startlingly simple. She preferred the night shift, when the house was quiet and sleeping. She'd enter the room, sometimes sitting with her victim for hours, watching them sleep, building up to the moment. When she finally acted, it was swift. A pillow pressed over the face, hands around the throat. Once, witnesses would later testify, she'd used a wet cloth, making the suffocation slower, more agonizing. The victims who were conscious during their murder, and many were, found themselves in an impossible situation. Too weak to fight off a healthy woman in her prime. Too confused by medication or dementia to fully understand what was happening. And even if they could have called out, who would have heard? The elderly crying out in the night was commonplace in such households. By the time anyone checked, it would be over. After each murder, Leopoldine performed her grotesque ritual of care. She'd wash the body, dress it in clean nightclothes, arrange it peacefully in bed. She'd open a window to let the soul escape, she'd say later, revealing a superstitious streak that sat oddly alongside her calculated murders. Then she'd wait an appropriate amount of time, 30 minutes, an hour, before discovering the death and alerting the family. Her performances at these moments were masterful. The right amount of shock and sorrow. Tears that seemed genuine because perhaps, in some twisted way, they were not mourning for the victim, but for something broken inside herself that she couldn't name. She'd comfort the grieving family, help them with funeral arrangements, sometimes even attending the services. The ultimate betrayal, the murderer mourning alongside those she'd victimized. But Leopoldine wasn't content with just the act of killing. As her death toll rose, she began to augment her crimes with theft. This was the beginning of her unraveling, though she didn't realize it yet. The thrill of murder, which had once been enough, was wearing thin. She needed more money, more risk, more evidence of her power over her victims even after death. She started small. A piece of jewelry here, a little cash there. Things that might be explained away or attributed to the confusion that often surrounded a death in the home. But her greed grew bolder. She'd forged documents to make herself the beneficiary of small insurance policies. She'd convinced dying patients to change their wills in her favor, promising them extra care and comfort in their final days before ensuring those days came sooner than expected. One particular case illustrated her brazenness. In the spring of 1923, she was hired to care for Juliana Corner, a 78-year-old widow with no close family but considerable savings from her late husband's business. Leopoldine moved into Frau Corner's apartment in Leopoldstadt, taking over complete care of the elderly woman who was recovering from a stroke. Within weeks, neighbors noticed changes. Frau Corner, who'd been improving before Leopoldine's arrival, began to decline rapidly. She stopped appearing at her window where she'd usually sit to watch the street. The few visitors who were allowed to see her found her increasingly lethargic and confused. Leopoldine explained this away with medical-sounding jargon about secondary strokes and natural decline. What the neighbors didn't see was happening behind closed doors. Leopoldine had convinced Frau Corner to sign over power of attorney, then systematically began draining the woman's bank accounts. She purchased expensive items, a new coat, jewelry, furnishings for the apartment she shared with her still-living husband Franz, all on Frau Corner's accounts. When the widow had lucid moments and questioned these expenditures, Leopoldine would smile soothingly and explain they were medical necessities or household expenses. Then, in August of that year, Frau Corner died. Leopoldine reported it as a massive stroke, and the overworked doctor who'd been treating the elderly woman saw no reason to question the diagnosis. The funeral was small, just a handful of distant relatives and neighbors. Leopoldine wept at the service, telling anyone who'd listen how devoted she'd been to dear Juliana in her final months. But several of those distant relatives, when they began to settle Frau Corner's estate, discovered something disturbing. The widow's substantial savings had been virtually depleted. Bank records showed a series of large withdrawals and purchases in the months before her death. The signatures on the withdrawal slips looked questionable, not quite matching Frau Corner's distinctive handwriting. They filed a complaint with the police, but it went nowhere. Leopoldine produced the power of attorney documents, legal if obtained under questionable circumstances. She claimed Frau Corner had wanted to enjoy her final months, spending money on comforts and small luxuries. Who could prove otherwise? The woman was dead, and the dead tell no tales. This pattern repeated itself across Vienna. Theodora Gussman, 81, died under Leopoldine's care, her modest savings depleted. Ernst Waldheim, 77, changed his will to leave Leopoldine a substantial bequest mere days before his unexpected death. Hildegard Frank, 69, signed over her jewelry collection to Leopoldine in gratitude for devoted care a week before she stopped breathing in the middle of the night. The families suspected. Of course they suspected. But suspicion wasn't proof, and proof was nearly impossible to obtain. This was an era before modern forensics, before toxicology screens, before the kind of systemic investigation that might have revealed the pattern. Each death, taken individually, seemed unremarkable. An old person dying in their bed, cared for by a nurse, was the most natural thing in the world. And Leopoldine was extraordinarily good at playing the role of the wronged servant. When families questioned her, she'd become indignant. "I devoted myself to your mother's care. I was there when none of you could be bothered, and this is how you repay me." The guilt would work like a charm, and the accusations would fade away. But cracks were beginning to show. Leopoldine's greed was making her reckless. She was staying in positions for longer periods, killing multiple patients in the same household or neighborhood. She was spending her stolen money conspicuously, too conspicuously for someone supposedly earning a modest nurse's wage. And she was getting cocky, confident in her invulnerability. Her home life with Franz had deteriorated completely. He was suspicious of her nocturnal activities and the mysterious influx of money and goods. They fought constantly, their arguments echoing through the thin walls of their apartment building. Neighbors would hear Franz accusing her of theft, of God knows what else. Leopoldine would scream back, her voice carrying a cold fury that made people lock their doors. Franz himself had become an impediment to her activities. He drank away much of the money she brought home, and his loose tongue when drunk threatened to expose her. She began to contemplate a solution to the Franz problem, a solution that would be permanent. Meanwhile, in the offices of Vienna's police department, a young detective named Karl Sonnenberg was beginning to notice something odd. He'd been assigned to investigate several cases of financial fraud involving elderly victims, complaints that had been dismissed as civil matters rather than criminal ones. But as he reviewed the files, a name kept appearing: Leopoldine Kasparek. Not as a suspect, but as a witness. A caregiver who'd been present when wills were changed, when money was withdrawn, when elderly patients made unexpected financial decisions. Sonnenberg was intrigued. He began pulling files on deaths where Kasparek had been the attending nurse. What he found chilled him. Over a 3-year period, at least 15 patients under her direct care had died suddenly. The number might be higher, record-keeping was spotty, and Kasparek had worked in private homes where deaths often weren't officially documented. 15 deaths in 3 years, all elderly or infirm patients, all dying peacefully in their sleep or from sudden, unexpected complications, and all coincidentally dying after changing their wills or signing over financial control to their devoted caregiver. Taken individually, each case was unremarkable. Collectively, they formed a pattern that was deeply disturbing. Sonnenberg brought his findings to his superiors, but they were skeptical. Accusing a nurse, a woman no less, of serial murder was a serious matter. Where was the proof? Where were the witnesses? The bodies had all been buried without autopsy. There was no physical evidence, no confession, nothing but circumstantial connections and statistical improbability. But Sonnenberg was persistent. He began interviewing families, retracing Leopoldine's employment history, documenting the financial irregularities. And slowly, painstakingly, he began to build a case. Leopoldine, still oblivious to the net closing around her, took on another patient in early 1924. His name was Joseph Fritsch, a wealthy 76-year-old widower with a weak heart and no children. He lived alone in a large house in Hietzing, cared for by a rotating series of nurses who never stayed long. Joseph was demanding and difficult, prone to rage and paranoia. But Leopoldine wasn't intimidated. She saw Joseph Fritsch for what he was, her next victim, and potentially her most lucrative one yet. She moved into the house in February, taking complete control of his care. Within days, She'd isolated him from his few remaining friends and his financial advisors. Within weeks, she'd convinced him to change his will. What Leopoldine didn't know was that Joseph's lawyer, suspicious of the sudden changes, had contacted Detective Sonnenberg, and Sonnenberg, who'd been building his case for months, finally had the opening he needed. The trap was set. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and Leopoldine Kasparek's reign of terror was approaching its end, though not before one final, terrible act. Detective Karl Sonnenberg sat in the cramped back office of Vienna's 6th District Police Station, surrounded by files that detailed a horror story no one wanted to believe. The spring of 1924 was unseasonably cold, and the chill that crept through the building's drafty windows seemed fitting for the dark work consuming his days and nights. On the wall before him, he'd pinned a map of Vienna marked with red dots. Each dot represented a death, a patient who'd expired under Leopoldine Kasparek's care. When viewed together, they formed a trail of corpses stretching across the city like a constellation of tragedy. 15 confirmed cases, possibly more. Each one a human being whose final moments had been stolen by a woman they trusted to ease their suffering, not cause their ultimate one. The pattern was undeniable to Sonnenberg, but proving it would be another matter entirely. Austrian law in the 1920s was not equipped for this type of systematic investigation. Forensic pathology was in its infancy. The bodies were buried, most without autopsy, their graves scattered across Vienna's many cemeteries. Exhumation would require permission from families, court orders, and resources the police department didn't have. Besides, strangulation, if performed carefully, left minimal evidence, especially on bodies that had been embalmed and buried for months or years. What Sonnenberg had was circumstantial, a web of financial irregularities, suspicious timing, and a statistical improbability so staggering it screamed murder. But screaming murder wasn't the same as proving it. He needed something concrete, something that would convince a prosecutor to take action against a woman who, on the surface, appeared to be nothing more than a dedicated nurse with the unfortunate luck of losing many patients. His opportunity came through Joseph Fritzsch's lawyer, Dr. Heinrich Adler. The elderly Adler had been managing Fritzsch's affairs for over 2 decades and knew his client's mind intimately. When Fritzsch had suddenly demanded changes to his will, leaving a substantial bequest to a nurse he'd known for less than a month, Adler's suspicions had been aroused. The lawyer had done some digging of his own and discovered Leopoldine's employment history, noting with alarm the number of her former patients who died shortly after making similar financial arrangements. He'd brought this information to the police, where it eventually reached Sonnenberg's desk. Now, in March of 1924, Sonnenberg had the makings of a trap. Joseph Fritzsch was still alive, still under Leopoldine's care, and still in danger. The detective knew he had to act quickly, but he also knew he had only one chance. If he moved too soon, without sufficient evidence, Leopoldine would simply move on to her next victim. More careful this time, perhaps impossible to catch. If he waited too long, Fritzsch would become another name on the death list. Sonnenberg proposed a surveillance operation, unconventional for the time but necessary given the circumstances. He arranged for undercover officers to take positions near Fritzsch's house, watching the comings and goings. He instructed Adler to maintain contact with Fritzsch under the pretext of finalizing the will changes, using these visits to assess the old man's condition and Leopoldine's behavior. What they observed over the next 2 weeks was deeply troubling. Fritzsch, who'd been in relatively stable health when Leopoldine first arrived, was declining rapidly. He appeared increasingly lethargic during Adler's visits, often confused and drowsy. Leopoldine explained this as the progression of his heart condition, but Adler, now alert to the pattern, suspected something more sinister. The lawyer noted that medications in the house were not what Fritzsch's regular doctor had prescribed. When he discreetly inquired about this, Leopoldine became defensive, claiming she'd consulted with a specialist who'd recommended changes to the regimen. But when Adler verified this with the regular doctor, no such consultation had occurred. Sonnenberg's team also uncovered something else. Leopoldine had been visiting pawn shops across the city, selling jewelry and small valuables. When detectives traced the origins of these items, They discovered many had belonged to her deceased patients, pieces their families had been searching for, assuming they'd been lost or stolen by unknown parties during estate settlements. This was the evidence Sonnenberg needed. On March 28, 1924, he obtained a warrant for Leopoldine's arrest on charges of theft. Murder charges would come later if they could build a strong enough case, but the theft accusations provided legal grounds to remove her from Fritsch's home and begin a formal investigation. The arrest itself was anticlimactic. Sonnenberg and two uniformed officers arrived at Fritsch's house on a gray morning, the kind of dreary weather that makes Vienna feel like it's trapped in permanent twilight. They found Leopoldine in the kitchen, preparing what she called special tea for her patient. Though later analysis would reveal the tea contained a dangerous amount of sedatives, enough to keep the elderly man docile and confused. When informed she was under arrest, Leopoldine didn't panic. Instead, she became coldly indignant, demanding to know who would care for poor Herr Fritsch in her absence. "I'm the only one who understands his needs," she insisted. "Without me, he'll die within days." The statement, intended to demonstrate her indispensability, instead struck Sonnenberg as chillingly prophetic and possibly threatening. At the police station, Leopoldine was interrogated for hours. The initial questioning focused on the theft charges, the jewelry, the financial irregularities, the forged documents. She denied everything at first, then shifted to claiming the patients had given her these items freely, gifts in gratitude for her devoted care. When presented with evidence of forgery, she became emotional, weeping and claiming she was being persecuted because she was a poor woman without powerful connections. But Sonnenberg was patient. He'd spent months preparing for this moment, and he systematically worked through each case, each suspicious death, each convenient financial transaction. As the hours wore on, Leopoldine's composure began to crack. Her stories became inconsistent. She couldn't remember which patients had supposedly given her which items. Her timeline of events contradicted the documented evidence. Finally, after nearly 8 hours of interrogation, Sonnenberg shifted his approach. He stopped asking about the thefts and asked instead about her childhood, her marriage, her feelings about the wealthy patients she'd cared for. This psychological approach, unusual for the time, seemed to catch Leopoldine off guard. She began to talk, carefully at first, then with increasing bitterness. She spoke about the unfairness of life, the way the rich treated people like her as less than human, the hypocrisy of families who neglected their elderly relatives until death made them suddenly generous with false grief. As she talked, Sonnenberg heard something beneath her words. Not quite a confession, but an acknowledgement of anger, of resentment, of satisfaction in seeing the privileged brought low. "They deserved what they got," she said at one point, referring to the families who'd accused her of theft. The statement was ambiguous. Deserved to have their jewelry stolen? Or deserved something more? Sonnenberg carefully noted the phrasing. The interrogation ended without a full confession, but Sonnenberg had enough for the prosecutor to proceed with theft charges and to begin building the murder case. Leopoldine was held without bail, considered a flight risk given the growing list of accusations against her. In her cell that first night, Leopoldine was reportedly calm, almost serene. Fellow prisoners would later describe her as unervingly composed, singing softly to herself, occasionally laughing at some private joke. When a cellmate asked what she found amusing, Leopoldine allegedly replied, "I'm thinking about how surprised they all looked, like they couldn't believe I'd dare." The cellmate, unsettled by the comment, reported it to the guards, but its significance wouldn't be fully understood until much later. Meanwhile, Sonnenberg's investigation accelerated. With Leopoldine in custody, witnesses who'd been afraid to speak before began coming forward. Neighbors who'd heard strange sounds from patients' rooms in the night. Former co-workers who'd noticed suspicious patterns but had dismissed their concerns. Family members who'd harbored doubts but had been too consumed by guilt to voice them. Most significantly, Dr. Wilhelm Hoffmann, a physician who'd signed several death certificates for Leopoldine's patients, came forward with disturbing information. He admitted that he'd always felt rushed when examining the bodies, pressured by Leopoldine to sign quickly so the family could begin funeral arrangements. He'd noticed minor inconsistencies, bruising that seemed odd, faces that appeared strained rather than peaceful, but had attributed these to the illness and the death process rather than foul play. Now, reviewing his memories with Sonnenberg's investigation in mind, Hoffman realized he'd been manipulated. Leopoldine had always been present during his examinations, hovering, explaining away anything unusual, subtly directing his attention away from anything problematic. He'd been an unwitting accomplice in covering up her crimes, and the realization devastated him. The breakthrough came when Sonnenberg obtained permission to exhume 3 of the bodies, those buried most recently and in conditions that might have preserved evidence. The exhumations took place in early April, conducted at night to avoid attracting public attention. What the forensic doctors found was damning. 2 of the 3 bodies showed signs consistent with strangulation or suffocation: petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes, damage to the hyoid bone, bruising patterns on the neck and chest. While not definitive after months of burial, the evidence was strongly suggestive of violent death rather than natural causes. Armed with this medical evidence, combined with the financial fraud documentation and the witness statements, the prosecutor felt confident enough to add murder charges. On April 15, 1924, Leopoldine Kasparek was formally charged with 3 counts of murder, with the understanding that additional charges might follow as the investigation continued. The news exploded across Vienna like a bomb. Newspapers ran sensational headlines: "Angel of Death arrested," "Vienna nurse accused of murder spree," "How many did she kill?" The story had everything journalists loved: a female killer, elderly victims, a combination of theft and murder that suggested both greed and something darker. Public reaction was mixed. Some were horrified, immediately believing the worst. Others were skeptical, finding it difficult to accept that a woman, especially one in a caring profession, could be capable of such systematic evil. Several women's groups initially rallied to Leopoldine's defense, seeing her as potentially being scapegoated by a male-dominated legal system uncomfortable with women in professional roles. But as more details emerged, public opinion shifted decisively against her. The evidence was simply too compelling, the pattern too clear. This wasn't a case of a woman being persecuted for stepping outside traditional roles. This was a predator who'd weaponized caregiving, turning trust into a tool for murder. In her cell, Leopoldine seemed to relish the attention. She gave interviews to journalists, carefully framing herself as a victim of circumstance and class prejudice. She was articulate, presenting herself as an educated woman trapped by poverty, driven to desperate measures by a society that offered her no other options. She spoke movingly about the suffering she'd witnessed, the indignity of the elderly abandoned by their families, the impossible demands placed on caregivers. What she never did was confess. She maintained her innocence on the murder charges while offering increasingly elaborate justifications for her financial crimes. The stolen jewelry had been gifts. The forged documents were misunderstandings. The convenient deaths were tragic coincidences. But her mask occasionally slipped. In one unguarded moment with a journalist, she was asked if she felt sorry for the families of the deceased. Her response was chilling: "I feel sorry for the patients who were burdens on families who couldn't wait to be rid of them. I gave them peace." When the journalist pressed her on what she meant by "gave them peace," Leopoldine smiled slightly and said, "Everyone dies eventually. Some just need help getting there." The statement, published in the Wiener Zeitung the next day, created a firestorm. Everyone dies eventually. Some just need help getting there. It wasn't quite a confession, but it was close enough to ignite public fury. Outside the prison, crowds began to gather. Angry mobs calling for justice, for execution, for revenge. The police had to increase security around the facility, fearing the mob might try to drag Leopoldine out and deliver their own brutal verdict. Inside the prosecutor's office, the legal team worked feverishly to build an airtight case. They knew that Leopoldine's trial would be one of the most closely watched in Austrian history, and they couldn't afford mistakes. Detective Sonnenberg continued his investigation, now with full departmental support and resources that had been denied him before. He traveled across Vienna, interviewing anyone who'd had contact with Leopoldine during her years as a caregiver. What emerged was a portrait of a woman who'd led a carefully constructed double life. To her employers and most colleagues, She'd been the perfect nurse, devoted, tireless, compassionate. But to those who knew her more intimately, a different picture emerged. A former neighbor recalled Leopoldine bragging about expensive purchases, laughing when asked how she could afford such luxuries on a nurse's salary. "I have my methods," she'd said with a wink. At the time, the neighbor had assumed she meant she was good at finding bargains. Now, the statement took on a sinister meaning. A pawnbroker identified Leopoldine as a regular customer, bringing in jewelry and valuables every few weeks. He'd been suspicious. The items were clearly expensive, and she didn't fit the profile of someone who'd owned such things. But business was business, and he'd asked no questions. Now, confronted with photographs of the murdered victims wearing the same jewelry Leopoldine had pawned, he was overcome with guilt. Most damning were the medical records that Sonnenberg managed to obtain. When he compared the health trajectories of patients before and after Leopoldine's arrival, a stark pattern emerged. Patients who'd been stable or even improving would suddenly decline within weeks of her taking over their care. Their symptoms didn't match the progression of their diagnosed conditions. They became lethargic, confused, weak, then dead. One physician, reviewing the records, noted that the symptoms were consistent with deliberate medication overdoses or the withholding of necessary treatments. Leopoldine had been systematically weakening her victims before killing them, making their eventual deaths seem like natural progressions rather than murder. Franz Kasparek, Leopoldine's husband, was brought in for questioning. He was a broken man, alcoholic, unemployed, living on the money his wife had brought home without asking too many questions about its origins. Now, faced with the magnitude of what she'd done, he crumbled completely. He told Sonnenberg about the night terrors, how Leopoldine would wake screaming, though she'd never explain what haunted her dreams. He described her mood swings, periods of almost manic excitement when she'd return from work, spending money recklessly, talking rapidly about her superiority over the fools who employed her. Then there would be dark periods when she'd sit for hours in silence, staring at nothing, unreachable. Most significantly, Franz revealed that Leopoldine had tried to take out a life insurance policy on him several months earlier. He'd refused, made suspicious by her insistence and the unusually large payout she'd requested. Shortly after his refusal, he'd become mysteriously ill, violent nausea, weakness, confusion. He'd recovered after a few days, but now, looking back, he wondered if his wife had been trying to poison him. The realization that he'd been living with his potential murderer left him shaking. The prosecutor's team also discovered that Leopoldine had been researching anatomy and toxicology at Vienna's public library. Librarians recalled her spending hours poring over medical texts, taking careful notes. She'd been particularly interested in sections about strangulation, suffocation, and poisons that mimicked natural illness. This wasn't impulsive killing, it was studied, methodical, informed by research and planning. As spring turned to summer, the investigation expanded beyond Vienna. Police in surrounding regions began reviewing their own unsolved deaths involving elderly patients. Leopoldine had worked in Linz for several months in 1919, in Salzburg briefly in 1921. Bodies were exhumed, records were reviewed. The potential victim count continued to climb. In her cell, Leopoldine seemed to sense the walls closing in. Her demeanor changed. The confident, articulate woman who'd given interviews now became withdrawn and paranoid. She claimed the guards were poisoning her food, an ironic complaint given the accusations against her. She refused to eat for days, dropping weight at an alarming rate. Prison doctors who examined her noted she displayed signs of what we'd now recognize as antisocial personality disorder. She showed no genuine empathy for her victims, instead expressing resentment that they'd betrayed her by dying in ways that attracted suspicion. She spoke about the deceased patients as if they'd been obstacles or objects rather than human beings. When asked directly if she felt remorse, she responded, "For what? For being better at survival than they were." Her attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named Dr. Stefan Muller, faced an impossible task. The evidence against his client was overwhelming, and her own statements kept making his job harder. He pleaded with her to show contrition, to express remorse, to give him something he could use to argue for leniency. But Leopoldine refused. "I won't grovel," she told him. "I won't pretend to be sorry for things I'm not sorry for. Let them judge me. Let them condemn me. They've been condemning women like me our entire lives. At least now they have a reason." Mueller tried to build a defense based on diminished capacity, arguing that his client's difficult childhood and the traumas of poverty had damaged her psychologically, making her unable to distinguish right from wrong. He brought in psychiatrists who testified about the effects of long-term abuse and deprivation on moral development. But the prosecution countered with evidence of Leopoldine's calculated planning. The research, the careful selection of victims, the disposal of evidence, the financial fraud that showed clear understanding of legal and illegal actions. This wasn't insanity. It was evil. By August 1924, the investigation had documented at least 23 probable murders, with several more possible cases where evidence had been destroyed or was insufficient for formal charges. 23 human beings, grandmothers and grandfathers, widows and widowers, people who'd lived full lives and deserved peaceful deaths, strangled or smothered or poisoned by a woman they trusted. The trial was scheduled for September, and Vienna waited with morbid fascination. Would she confess? Would she show remorse? Would there be dramatic revelations? The newspapers promised the trial of the century, and for once, the hyperbole seemed justified. Sonnenberg, exhausted after months of relentless investigation, prepared his testimony. He devoted himself to this case with an intensity that had cost him his health and nearly his marriage. But he'd done it because the victims deserved justice. These forgotten elderly whose deaths had been dismissed as unremarkable deserved to have someone fight for them. On the night before the trial was set to begin, Sonnenberg visited the Vienna Central Cemetery, walking among the graves of Leopoldine's confirmed victims. He'd memorized all their names, all their stories. Juliana Korner, who'd loved opera and had sung in her youth. Theodora Gussmann, who'd raised 7 children alone after her husband died in the war. Ernst Waldheim, who'd been a schoolteacher for 40 years, shaping young minds. They'd been people, not just statistics. And tomorrow he would make sure the court and history remembered that. The Vienna Regional Criminal Court on September 15, 1924, was a circus of humanity crammed into a space designed for dignity and order. Every seat in the gallery was filled hours before the proceedings began. People who couldn't get inside pressed against the building's windows, craning to catch glimpses of the defendant who'd become Austria's most notorious female killer. The courtroom itself was a relic of imperial grandeur. High ceilings adorned with allegorical paintings of justice, dark wood paneling that absorbed light and sound, and a raised judge's bench that loomed over the proceedings like a throne. The air was thick with anticipation, sweat, and the acrid smell of fear. When Leopoldine Kasparek was led into the courtroom, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. She'd transformed herself since her last public appearance. Gone was the defiant woman who'd given interviews and made provocative statements. The Leopoldine who faced the court was thin to the point of gauntness, her skin sallow, her dark hair pulled back severely from a face that seemed carved from wax. She wore a simple black dress, chosen by her attorney to suggest mourning and respectability, and moved with the mechanical precision of someone in shock. But her eyes told a different story. Dark, alert, constantly scanning the courtroom, they held neither fear nor remorse. Instead, there was something calculating in her gaze, as if even now, facing 23 murder charges, she was looking for angles, for weaknesses, for escape routes. The presiding judge, Johann Rothstein, was a veteran of 40 years on the bench. He'd seen every variety of human darkness, murders of passion, killings born of desperation, violence fueled by madness. But this case unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. There was something particularly disturbing about a woman who'd turned caregiving into murder, who'd weaponized the very trust that made society function. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Chief Prosecutor Andreas Weber, a precise man known for building cases like a master craftsman building furniture. Each piece carefully fitted, every joint reinforced. He rose slowly, letting the silence build before speaking. "The accused," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, is charged with 23 counts of murder. 23 human beings whose final moments were spent in terror and betrayal at the hands of someone they trusted. But these charges represent more than numbers. They represent the systematic exploitation of our most vulnerable citizens by someone who should have been their protector. Weber painted a meticulous picture of Leopoldine's killing spree, walking the jury through each victim's story. He didn't shy away from the gruesome details, the mechanics of strangulation, the minutes it took for a frail, elderly person to die, the conscious choice made in each murder. He presented the exhumation evidence, the forensic findings, the medical records that showed the suspicious pattern of decline. He detailed the financial crimes that had run parallel to the murders, the forged documents, the manipulated wills, the stolen jewelry. He showed how greed and power had fused into a toxic motivation, creating a killer who saw her victims as resources to be exploited and then eliminated. Leopoldine Kasparek is not insane, Weber declared, his voice rising with controlled passion. She is not confused. She is not a victim of circumstances. She is a predator who found the perfect hunting ground, the homes of the elderly sick, where death is expected and questions are rarely asked. She is a thief who discovered that dead victims tell no tales. And she is a murderer who killed not in heat of passion, not in madness, but with cold, calculated precision. The defense attorney, Stefan Muller, faced an impossible task. His opening statement acknowledged the horror of the crimes while trying to contextualize them within Leopoldine's traumatic history. He spoke of poverty, abuse, the grinding dehumanization of life at society's bottom. He argued that his client had been damaged by her experiences, her moral compass destroyed by years of exploitation. "We are not here to excuse what happened," Muller said carefully. "We are here to understand it, to recognize that monsters are made, not born, that a society which treats its caregivers as disposable, which pays them poverty wages to do work no one else will do, which offers them no dignity or respect, such a society bears some responsibility when those caregivers break under the weight of injustice." It was a philosophical argument more than a legal one, and Muller knew it, but he had nothing else. His client refused to testify in her own defense, refused to show remorse, refused to give him anything workable. He was defending not just a woman but an ideology, that social conditions could explain, if not excuse, even the most heinous crimes. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks. Witness after witness took the stand. Family members of the deceased, colleagues who'd worked with Leopoldine, medical experts who explained how the victims died. The testimony was often heartbreaking. One daughter spoke of her mother's final weeks under Leopoldine's care. "Mother kept trying to tell me something," the woman said, tears streaming down her face. "But she was so confused, so weak. She'd grab my hand and say, 'Don't leave me alone with her.' I thought it was just dementia. I thought she was confused. I left her alone. And 2 days later, she was dead." A grandson testified about his grandfather's mysterious decline after Leopoldine took over his care. He'd been walking, talking, laughing. Within 2 weeks, he couldn't get out of bed. She said it was his heart, but his doctor had given him years to live. "She killed him, I know she did, and I'll never forgive myself for not seeing it sooner." The medical testimony was particularly damning. Forensic experts explained the evidence from the exhumed bodies, the patterns of bruising, the damage to delicate throat structures, the signs of oxygen deprivation. They showed photographs that made jury members look away in horror, images of elderly bodies bearing the marks of violent death. Detective Sonnenberg's testimony lasted 2 full days. He walked the jury through his investigation, the painstaking process of connecting deaths across years and neighborhoods, the statistical analysis that showed Leopoldine's presence was the common factor in an impossible cluster of deaths. He presented financial records, pawn shop receipts, forged documents, a paper trail of greed and murder. Under cross-examination, Muller tried to poke holes in the prosecution's timeline, to suggest that some deaths might have been natural, that the financial crimes didn't prove murder. But Sonnenberg was unshakable, his testimony precise and devastating. The trial's most dramatic moment came in the 3rd week when the prosecution played a recording, a new technology, barely admissible in court. It was from one of Leopoldina's police interrogations, a moment when she'd thought the recording device was turned off. Her voice crackled through the courtroom speakers. They were going to die anyway. Does it matter if it happened months earlier than it might have? I gave them peace. I ended their suffering. And yes, I took what they wouldn't have needed anymore. Why should it go to ungrateful families who'd neglected them? I earned it. I was there when they needed someone, even if that someone was the one who ended it. The courtroom erupted. The judge hammered for order. Leopoldine sat motionless, her face betraying nothing, while around her, people shouted accusations and wept. It wasn't quite a confession. She'd been careful even in her unguarded moment, but it was close enough to seal her fate. The defense called only 3 witnesses, 2 psychiatrists who testified about Leopoldine's psychological damage and diminished capacity, and a social worker who spoke about the conditions caregivers faced. It was thin gruel compared to the prosecution's feast of evidence. Mueller's closing argument was eloquent and ultimately futile. He acknowledged his client's guilt while pleading for understanding, for mercy, for recognition of the societal failures that had created this tragedy. He argued against the death penalty, suggesting that execution would be vengeance, not justice. Weber's closing was brief and brutal. The defense asks you to understand the defendant's difficult circumstances, but millions of Austrians face poverty and hardship without becoming serial killers. The defense asks for mercy. But where was mercy when Frau Korner begged for her life? When her Waldheim gasped for air? When 23 human beings died in terror at the hands of someone they trusted? He paused, making eye contact with each juror. This is not a case about social conditions. This is a case about evil, pure, calculated evil. And the law provides only one response adequate to that evil. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty of 23 murders, guilty of fraud, guilty of forgery, guilty of theft. The courtroom exploded again. Some cheering, some weeping, some simply sitting in stunned silence. Leopoldine remained motionless as the verdicts were read, her face an expressionless mask. Only when the judge began to speak about sentencing did something flicker in her eyes. Not fear, but defiance. Judge Rothstein spoke slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to pronounce. Leopoldine Kasparek, you have been found guilty of crimes so heinous, so calculated, so utterly devoid of human compassion that this court struggles to comprehend how someone could commit them. You betrayed the most sacred trust, that between caregiver and patient. You turned mercy into murder. You weaponized vulnerability. He paused, letting the words sink in. In my 40 years on the bench, I have never encountered a defendant who showed such complete absence of remorse, such utter disregard for human life. You are a danger to society, incapable of rehabilitation, undeserving of mercy. The judge's gavel rose and fell. This court sentences you to death by hanging. May God have mercy on your soul, since you had none for your victims. The courtroom erupted once more. Leopoldine finally showed emotion, not fear or sadness, but rage. She stood abruptly, her chair crashing backward. You call me a monster? She shouted over the chaos. You who built a world that grinds women like me into dust. You who pay poverty wages for dirty work and then condemn us when we take what should have been ours. I regret nothing. I would do it all again. Guards rushed forward, subduing her and dragging her from the courtroom as she continued to scream accusations and justifications. Her voice echoed through the marble halls long after she'd been removed, a final testament to her complete inability or unwillingness to accept responsibility for her actions. In the weeks following the verdict, appeals were filed and predictably denied. Women's rights groups who'd initially supported Leopoldine quietly distanced themselves, recognizing that her case did no favors to the cause of women's equality. Some psychiatric professionals argued that she should be studied rather than executed, that understanding her psychology could prevent future killers. But public sentiment was overwhelmingly in favor of the death penalty. The families of the victims had waited months for justice, and they would accept nothing less than the ultimate punishment, Newspapers ran editorials supporting the sentence, arguing that some crimes were so monstrous they required the most severe response. Leopoldine spent her final months in a solitary cell, refusing visitors except for her lawyer, who tried unsuccessfully to get her to show some remorse that might lead to commutation. She spent her days reading medical texts mostly, even now fascinated by the mechanics of death, and writing. She produced a lengthy manuscript defending her actions, arguing that she'd been an agent of mercy in a cruel world. The prison authorities confiscated and destroyed it, fearing it would be published and glorify her crimes. The execution was scheduled for March 20th, 1925, exactly 1 year after her arrest. It was carried out at dawn in the prison courtyard, with only required officials present. Accounts of her final moments vary. Some witnesses claimed she went to the gallows silently, with dignity. Others reported she fought, screaming about injustice until the hood was placed over her head. What all accounts agree on is that Leopoldine Kasparek showed no repentance in her final moments. She didn't ask forgiveness from God or from the families of her victims. She didn't acknowledge the horror of what she'd done. She remained, to the very end, convinced she'd been wronged by a society that condemned her for actions she saw as justified. The trapdoor opened at 6:17 a.m. Death was instantaneous. The executioner had insisted on that, one final mercy that Leopoldine herself had never granted her victims. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, with no service and no mourners. Franz Kasparek, her husband, died of liver failure 6 months later, a broken man who'd never recovered from the knowledge of what he'd lived alongside. The families of the victims tried to move on, though the trauma of Leopoldine's betrayal haunted them for years. Several descendants, interviewed decades later, spoke of trust issues that persisted through generations, an inability to leave elderly relatives in anyone's care, a suspicion of caregivers that bordered on paranoia. Detective Sonnenberg never worked another murder case. The investigation had consumed him, and while he'd achieved justice, the cost had been high. He retired from the police force in 1926 and spent his remaining years working with organizations that advocated for better training and oversight of elder care workers. The Vienna care industry was transformed by the scandal. New regulations required background checks, mandatory reporting of patient deaths, and regular inspections of care facilities. The Kasparek case became a cautionary tale taught in nursing schools, a reminder that the power to care for the vulnerable is also the power to harm them, and that vigilance is the price of trust. History has not been kind to Leopoldine Kasparek's memory, nor should it be. She remains a cautionary tale about what happens when resentment, greed, and access to vulnerable victims combine in a single individual. Modern criminologists who study her case note several factors that contributed to her killing spree: lack of oversight in elder care, poor training, inadequate pay that might have driven financial desperation, and a societal tendency to dismiss the concerns and deaths of elderly people as unremarkable. But these societal factors, while worth examining, don't excuse what Leopoldine did. Millions of people face poverty, abuse, and exploitation without becoming serial killers. She made choices, deliberate, calculated choices, to steal lives for profit and pleasure. She transformed caregiving into a weapon, trust into a trap. The exact number of her victims may never be known. 23 murders were proven in court, but investigators believe the true count might be higher, perhaps as many as 30 or 40 over her decade-long killing spree. Bodies buried without autopsy. Deaths attributed to natural causes that might have been murder. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that Leopoldine Kasparek was one of Austria's most prolific serial killers, a woman who hunted the vulnerable in their own beds, who strangled the life from those too weak to fight back, who stole not just possessions but the peaceful deaths her victims deserved. She remains a monster of Vienna's darkest history, a predator who wore the mask of mercy while dealing death. Her story serves as a grim reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence and chaos. Sometimes it arrives with gentle hands and soothing words, with promises of care and comfort. Sometimes the monster isn't the stranger in the dark alley. Sometimes the monster is the one you invite into your home, the one you trust with your most vulnerable moments, the one who smiles while plotting your end. Leopoldine Kasparek proved that the most dangerous predators are the ones we never see coming, the ones who hide behind the very roles designed to protect us. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying lesson of all. Vienna has never forgotten her. The Strangler of Vienna, the Angel of Death, the woman who turned healing hands into weapons of murder. Her name remains synonymous with betrayal, her crimes a dark chapter in the city's long history. And somewhere in that unmarked prison grave, she lies forgotten by all but those who study the darkest corners of human nature. No flowers mark her resting place. No one mourns her passing. She left behind only victims, grief, and a legacy of horror that still chills the blood nearly a century later. This is the story of Leopoldine Kasparek, a woman who hunted the helpless, who murdered for profit, who strangled the life from those who trusted her most. A monster who proved that sometimes the greatest evil comes wrapped in the guise of compassion. And now, as dawn breaks over Vienna once more, we leave this tale of darkness behind, but we never forget its lessons. We never forget that trust is precious, that vigilance is necessary, and that evil, when given opportunity and access, will always find its victims. The Strangler of Vienna is gone, but the warning her crimes whisper across the decades remains. Be careful whom you trust with your life. Sometimes the hand that feeds you is the same hand that will close around your throat. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.